The year is 1200, and across the Christian world, a profound restlessness stirs in the hearts of both the faithful and the ambitious. The echoes of the Third Crusade have faded into memory, leaving behind a complex tapestry of triumph and disappointment that would shape the next great expedition to the Holy Land. In the papal chambers of Rome, Innocent III, barely 37 years old and possessed of an unwavering vision for Christendom, contemplates the fractured state of the Eastern and Western churches, the persistent Muslim control over Jerusalem, and the growing weakness of the Byzantine Empire that had once stood as Christianity's eastern bulwark. The Byzantine Empire, that magnificent continuation of Rome itself, had endured for nearly 9 centuries since Constantine founded his new Rome on the shores of the Bosphorus. Yet by the dawn of the 13th century, the empire that had once stretched from the Danube to the Euphrates, from the Caucasus to Crete, existed as but a shadow of its former glory. The catastrophic defeat at Manzikert in 1071 had stripped away most of Anatolia, the empire's heartland, to the advancing Seljuk Turks. The subsequent civil wars and the rise of powerful noble families had further weakened imperial authority, while the growing commercial dominance of Italian maritime republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, had gradually eroded Byzantine control over the lucrative trade routes that had once filled the imperial treasury. In Constantinople itself, the magnificent city of nearly 500,000 souls, the signs of imperial decline were increasingly visible to those who knew how to read them. The great walls that had protected the city for 8 centuries remained formidable, but they required constant maintenance that strained the imperial budget. The magnificent Hagia Sophia still dominated the skyline, its great dome a testament to Byzantine architectural genius. Yet the empire struggled to maintain the countless other churches, monasteries, and public buildings that made Constantinople the most splendid city in the Christian world. The emperor's court, once the center of a sophisticated diplomatic network that had played barbarian kingdoms against each other for centuries, now found itself increasingly isolated and reactive rather than proactive in its foreign policy. The current occupant of the imperial throne, Alexios III Angelos, had seized power in 1195 through a palace coup that deposed his own brother, Isaac II Angelos, in a move that exemplified the political instability that had plagued the empire throughout the 12th century. Alexios III, though not without certain administrative capabilities, lacked the vision and energy necessary to reverse the empire's decline. His reign was marked by increasing reliance on mercenary forces rather than the traditional theme system that had once provided the empire with reliable military manpower, and by a growing tendency to solve immediate financial crises through debasing the currency and imposing additional taxes on an already overburdened population. The emperor's court, still magnificent in its ceremonial splendor, masked a reality of competing factions and personal ambitions that made coherent policymaking increasingly difficult. The great noble families, many of whom controlled vast estates in the remaining imperial territories, pursued their own interests with little regard for broader imperial needs. The military aristocracy, the landed magnates who had traditionally provided the empire with its officer corps, found themselves increasingly at odds with the civil bureaucracy that administered the empire's finances and diplomacy. Meanwhile, the urban population of Constantinople, dependent on imported grain and increasingly expensive luxury goods, grew restless as economic conditions deteriorated and the imperial government proved unable to provide either security or prosperity. The religious situation added another layer of complexity to the empire's challenges. The schism between the Eastern and Western churches, formalized in 1054 but rooted in centuries of theological, cultural, and political differences, had created a fundamental obstacle to cooperation between Byzantium and the Latin West. The Byzantine emperor, as the protector of Eastern Christianity, could not simply submit to papal authority without undermining the very foundations of his legitimacy. Yet, without some accommodation with Rome, the empire found itself increasingly isolated as the Western kingdoms grew in strength and confidence. The common people of Constantinople, from the silk merchants and artisans of the middle districts to the dock workers and small shopkeepers of the lower city, experienced these broader political and economic trends as a gradual erosion of their traditional way of life. The great trade routes that had once made their city the commercial hub of the known world increasingly bypassed Constantinople as Italian merchants developed direct relationships with suppliers in Alexandria, Trebizond, and other eastern ports. The imperial workshops that had once produced the magnificent silks, jewelry, and artwork that were coveted throughout Europe found themselves competing with products from Italy, Flanders, and other Western centers that could often undercut Byzantine prices while offering comparable quality. Yet for all these challenges, Constantinople remained a city of wonder and magnificence that never failed to impress visitors from the West. The Great Hippodrome, where chariot races and other spectacles had entertained emperors and people for centuries, continued to host elaborate ceremonies that demonstrated the empire's claims to Roman continuity. The countless churches and monasteries that dotted the city's 7 hills housed some of the most precious relics in Christendom, from fragments of the true cross to the crown of thorns, the purple robe of Christ, and countless other objects that attracted pilgrims from across the known world. The imperial palace complex, with its throne rooms, reception halls, and private apartments, remained a center of sophisticated court culture that preserved classical learning and artistic traditions that had been lost or transformed in the West. The city's defenses, though requiring constant maintenance, remained formidable to any potential attacker. The Great Sea Wall that protected the city from naval assault along the Golden Horn had been strengthened and modified over the centuries to meet changing military technologies. The famous Land Wall, that magnificent fortification that stretched from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, consisted of a complex system of inner and outer walls, towers, and defensive positions that had successfully repelled every attack for over 8 centuries. The great chain that could be stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn provided additional protection for the city's harbor, while the narrow entrance to the Bosphorus allowed the imperial navy to control access to the Black Sea and the rich trade routes that connected Constantinople with the wheat fields of southern Russia and the luxury goods of the Far East. In the West, the political situation was equally complex but marked by very different dynamics. The Holy Roman Empire, under the leadership of Otto IV, was engaged in a prolonged struggle with Pope Innocent III over the fundamental question of whether temporal or spiritual authority should be supreme in Christian society. This conflict, which would continue in various forms for centuries, created opportunities for ambitious nobles and enterprising merchants to advance their interests, while the great powers were distracted by their mutual antagonism. The Kingdom of France, under Philip Augustus, was consolidating royal authority and developing the administrative and military capabilities that would eventually make it the dominant power in Western Europe. England, under the erratic leadership of King John, was experiencing the internal conflicts that would ultimately lead to Magna Carta and the constitutional limitations on royal power that would influence political development throughout the English-speaking world. The Italian peninsula remained politically fragmented, with the Papal States, the Norman kingdoms of the south, and the rapidly growing commercial republics of the north each pursuing their own interests with little regard for broader Italian unity. It was in this context that Venice, under the leadership of Doge Enrico Dandolo, emerged as a dominant force in Mediterranean commerce and a crucial player in the events that would ultimately lead to the sack of Constantinople. The Venetian Republic, through a combination of diplomatic skill, commercial innovation, and naval power, had established trading posts and commercial privileges throughout the eastern Mediterranean, making it the primary intermediary between the Byzantine Empire and the markets of Western Europe. The Venetian relationship with Byzantium was particularly complex, marked by centuries of commercial cooperation punctuated by periods of conflict over trading rights and territorial disputes. The famous Golden Bull of 1082, granted by Emperor Alexios I Komnenos to Venice in return for naval support against the Normans, had provided Venetian merchants with extraordinary privileges throughout the Byzantine Empire, including exemption from most taxes and the right to maintain their own quarters in Constantinople and other major cities. These privileges, while enormously beneficial to Venice, had created resentment among Byzantine merchants and administrators who saw their own commercial opportunities limited by foreign competition. The growing tension between Venice and Byzantium was exacerbated by the empire's attempts to balance Venetian privileges against similar concessions to other Italian maritime republics, particularly Genoa and Pisa. The massacre of Latins in Constantinople in 1182, during which thousands of Western merchants and their families were killed by mobs encouraged by imperial officials, had created a legacy of mistrust and desire for revenge that would influence Venetian policy for decades. The subsequent confiscation of Venetian property and the imprisonment of Venetian merchants had further damaged relations between the two powers, while the empire's growing reliance on Genoese and Pisan merchants had threatened Venice's traditional commercial dominance in Byzantine markets. Pope Innocent III, observing these various political and economic tensions, saw an opportunity to advance his vision of a unified Christendom under papal leadership. The failure of the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem had left the Holy Land in Muslim hands, while the growing weakness of the Byzantine Empire threatened to leave Eastern Christianity vulnerable to further Islamic expansion. The Pope's solution was ambitious and would prove fateful. A new crusade that would not only recapture the Holy Land but also bring the Eastern Church back into communion with Rome, thereby creating a truly unified Christian world under papal authority. The theological justification for this new crusade drew on centuries of Christian thought about holy war and the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The Pope argued that the liberation of Jerusalem was not simply a political or military goal, but a spiritual necessity that would hasten the coming of God's kingdom on earth. The reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, in this view, was not merely a matter of ecclesiastical politics but a crucial step toward the restoration of Christian unity that had been broken by centuries of schism and misunderstanding. The practical challenges of organizing and financing such an expedition were enormous, requiring the coordination of resources from across Western Europe and the cooperation of secular rulers whose own political interests often conflicted with papal objectives. The financing of crusades had become increasingly sophisticated since the First Crusade, involving complex arrangements for taxation of church property, the sale of indulgences, and the provision of credit by Italian banking houses. The logistics of transporting, feeding, and equipping armies of tens of thousands of men across hundreds of miles of often hostile territory required organizational capabilities that pushed the limits of medieval administrative systems. The recruitment of crusaders drew on a combination of religious enthusiasm, political ambition, and economic opportunity that reflected the complex motivations of medieval society. The great nobles who took the cross saw an opportunity to demonstrate their piety while potentially acquiring new lands and resources in the East. The lesser nobility and urban merchants who joined the expedition were often motivated by a combination of religious conviction and the hope of commercial or political advancement. The common soldiers and craftsmen who made up the bulk of any crusading army were typically drawn by the promise of spiritual benefits, the possibility of plunder, and the adventure of travel to distant lands. The papal bull that officially proclaimed the Fourth Crusade emphasized the spiritual rewards that would await participants, including the remission of sins and the guarantee of salvation for those who died in the service of the cross. These powerful incentives, combined with the sophisticated propaganda campaign that accompanied the Crusade's proclamation, succeeded in generating enthusiasm among all levels of Western European society. The great churches and monasteries that served as centers of learning and communication played crucial roles in spreading the crusading message, while the emerging universities and cathedral schools provided intellectual justification for the Holy War. As the year 1200 drew to a close, the stage was set for a conflict that would forever alter the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean and mark the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire. The complex web of political, economic, and religious factors that had been building for decades was about to converge in a way that few contemporaries could have predicted. The ambitious papal vision of a unified Christendom, the commercial interests of Venice, the political instability of Byzantium, and the crusading enthusiasm of Western Europe were all about to collide in a series of events that would lead not to the liberation of Jerusalem but to the sack of Constantinople and the fragmentation of Eastern Christianity. The great irony of what was to come was that a crusade proclaimed to strengthen and unite the Christian world would instead deliver a devastating blow to its eastern bastion, weakening Christian resistance to Islamic expansion and creating divisions that would never be fully healed. The men who took the cross in 1200 and 1201 could hardly have imagined that their holy war would ultimately target not the Muslim rulers of Jerusalem but the Christian emperor of Constantinople, or that their quest for spiritual purification would culminate in the systematic looting of the most magnificent Christian city in the world. The organization of what would become known as the Fourth Crusade began in earnest in 1199, when Pope Innocent III issued the bull Post Miserabile, calling for a new expedition to the Holy Land. The papal proclamation was distributed throughout Western Europe by a network of clerical messengers and itinerant preachers, chief among them the charismatic folk of Neuilly, whose sermons drew massive crowds and inspired thousands to take the cross. The response was immediate and enthusiastic, with nobles from across France, Germany, and the Low Countries pledging their participation in what they believed would be a glorious enterprise that would restore Christian control over the Holy Land and earn them eternal salvation. Among the first and most prominent to respond to the papal call were Count Thibaut of Champagne, Count Louis of Blois, and Count Baldwin of Flanders, three of the most powerful nobles in northern France. These men, bound by ties of kinship and feudal obligation, brought with them not only their own considerable military resources but also their ability to recruit lesser nobles and knights from their extensive territories. The participation of such high-ranking nobles was crucial to the success of any crusading expedition, as their wealth, military experience, and political connections were essential for organizing and financing the massive logistical operation required to transport an army to the eastern Mediterranean. The initial enthusiasm for the crusade was remarkable, with contemporary chronicles reporting that recruitment exceeded all expectations. The great tournaments and courts that were regular features of aristocratic life became venues for crusading propaganda, as nobles competed to demonstrate their piety and martial prowess by taking the cross. The ceremony of taking the cross, with its powerful symbolism of following Christ's example of sacrifice, created a sense of shared purpose and divine mission that transcended the normal divisions of feudal society. Knights who had been enemies in territorial disputes found themselves bound together by their common commitment to the holy war, while the Church provided a unifying ideological framework that transformed individual acts of violence into a collective spiritual enterprise. However, the practical challenges of organizing a crusade quickly became apparent to the expedition's leaders. The financing of such an enormous undertaking required resources far beyond what any individual noble could provide, while the transportation of thousands of men, horses, and supplies across hundreds of miles of often hostile territory demanded logistical capabilities that stretched the limits of medieval organizational systems. The leaders of the crusade, meeting in council to address these challenges, made a decision that would prove fateful for the entire enterprise. They would seek to contract with one of the great maritime republics of Italy for transportation to the Holy Land. The choice of Venice as the expedition's transportation partner was not arbitrary but reflected the Republic's unparalleled naval capabilities and its extensive knowledge of eastern Mediterranean conditions. Venice had been involved in crusading expeditions since the First Crusade, providing ships, supplies, and naval expertise in exchange for commercial privileges and territorial concessions. The Venetian fleet, built in the Republic's famous arsenal, represented the most advanced maritime technology of the age, with galleys specifically designed for both military operations and the transportation of large numbers of men and horses. The Republic's merchants and navigators possessed detailed knowledge of winds, currents, and seasonal patterns that were essential for planning a successful voyage, while their network of trading posts throughout the Mediterranean provided potential bases for resupply and repair. The negotiations between the Crusade leaders and Venice began in early 1201, when a delegation of 6 prominent nobles, led by Geoffrey of Villehardouin, Marshal of Champagne, arrived in Venice to discuss terms for the expedition's transportation. The Venetian response to this delegation was carefully orchestrated to demonstrate both the Republic's wealth and its commitment to the crusading cause. The envoys were received with elaborate ceremony in the Doge's Palace, that magnificent complex of buildings that served as the center of Venetian government and commerce. The Great Hall where the negotiations took place was decorated with mosaics depicting Venice's glorious past and its special relationship with both the Byzantine Empire and the Holy Land, creating an atmosphere that emphasized the Republic's claims to be the natural intermediary between East and West. The man who dominated these negotiations was Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, who despite his advanced age of over 90 years and his near-total blindness remained one of the most formidable political figures in Europe. Dandolo's long life had spanned the entire period of Venice's rise to commercial dominance in the eastern Mediterranean, and his experience included direct involvement in the complex diplomatic and commercial relationships that connected Venice with both the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim states of the East. His blindness, the result of a head injury sustained either in combat or in a diplomatic incident in Constantinople decades earlier, had if anything sharpened his political instincts and his ability to read the motivations and weaknesses of those with whom he negotiated. The terms that emerged from these negotiations were set forth in a formal treaty that was signed with great ceremony in the presence of the Doge and the assembled nobles of Venice. The Republic agreed to provide transportation for 33,500 men, including 4,500 knights with their horses, 9,000 squires, and 20,000 foot soldiers, along with supplies sufficient for 9 months. The Venetian fleet would consist of specially constructed horse transports, supply ships, and 50 war galleys that would provide protection for the expedition during its voyage. In addition to transportation, Venice would provide 50,000 marks of silver to help finance the expedition, making the Republic not merely a contractor but a partner in the enterprise. The financial terms of the treaty were staggering by medieval standards, reflecting both the enormous scale of the undertaking and the sophisticated commercial practices that Venice had developed through centuries of international trade. The Crusaders agreed to pay 85,000 marks of silver, a sum that represented several times the annual income of most European kingdoms. This payment was to be made in installments, with the first substantial payment due when the Crusaders arrived in Venice to begin their voyage. The treaty also provided for the division of any conquests that might be made during the expedition, with Venice receiving 1/4 of all territorial gains and commercial privileges, an arrangement that clearly indicated the Republic's expectations that the crusade would result in significant territorial and commercial advantages. The recruitment of crusaders throughout Western Europe proceeded with remarkable success during 1201 and early 1202, as the combined efforts of papal legates, prominent nobles, and local clergy created a wave of enthusiasm that swept across all levels of society. The great nobles who had taken the cross used their extensive networks of vassals and allies to recruit knights and men-at-arms from their territories, while the Church provided both ideological justification and practical support for the recruitment effort. The promise of spiritual rewards, including the remission of sins and the guarantee of salvation for those who died in the service of the cross, proved particularly powerful in motivating participation among both nobles and commoners. The economic incentives for participation were also significant, though they varied considerably depending on social class and individual circumstances. For great nobles, the crusade offered opportunities to demonstrate their piety and martial prowess, while potentially acquiring new lands and resources in the east. For lesser nobles and knights, many of whom were experiencing economic difficulties due to the fragmentation of inheritances and the rising costs of maintaining their military equipment, the crusade represented a chance to restore their fortunes through plunder and the acquisition of new fiefs. For merchants and craftsmen, the expedition offered opportunities to establish new commercial relationships and gain access to the luxury goods of the East, while for common soldiers and peasants, the promise of plunder and the adventure of travel to distant lands provided powerful incentives for participation. The assembly of the crusading army in Venice during the summer of 1202 presented the Republic with both opportunities and challenges that would ultimately determine the expedition's fate. The arrival of thousands of armed men in a city of perhaps 100,000 inhabitants created enormous logistical pressures, while the need to house, feed, and organize such a large force strained the resources of even the wealthiest medieval city. The Venetians, with their characteristic efficiency and commercial acumen, had prepared for this influx by constructing temporary camps on the island of the Lido, where the Crusaders could be housed while final preparations for the voyage were completed. However, it quickly became apparent that the actual number of Crusaders who had arrived in Venice fell far short of the numbers specified in the treaty. Instead of the 33,500 men for whom transportation had been arranged, fewer than 12,000 had actually appeared, creating a financial crisis that threatened the entire enterprise. The shortfall was due to several factors, including the decision of many nobles to make independent arrangements for transportation, the natural attrition that occurred during the long journey to Venice, and the simple fact that medieval population estimates were often wildly inaccurate. The most significant defection was that of the expedition's original leader, Count Thibaut of Champagne, who had died during the preparations, leaving the crusade without its most prominent noble supporter. The financial implications of this shortfall were severe and immediate. The Crusaders who had arrived in Venice were collectively unable to pay the full amount specified in the treaty, leaving them with a debt of approximately 34,000 marks of silver to the Venetian Republic. This sum represented not merely a contractual obligation but a fundamental threat to the expedition's viability, as the Venetians had invested enormous resources in constructing the ships and gathering the supplies necessary for the voyage. The Republic had virtually emptied its treasury and suspended most normal commercial activities to fulfill its obligations under the treaty, making the Crusaders' inability to pay a crisis that affected the entire Venetian economy. The response of Doge Dandolo to this crisis demonstrated both his political skill and his understanding of the broader implications of the Crusade's failure. Rather than simply canceling the expedition and demanding immediate payment, which would have been his legal right under the treaty, the Doge proposed a solution that would allow the crusade to proceed while addressing Venice's financial needs. The Republic would defer payment of the outstanding debt in exchange for the Crusaders' assistance in recapturing the city of Zara, which had recently rebelled against Venetian authority and placed itself under the protection of the King of Hungary. The proposal to attack Zara was controversial from the moment it was presented to the crusading leadership, as it involved the use of an army that had been assembled for the Holy War against fellow Christians. The city of Zara, located on the Dalmatian coast, had been under Venetian control for generations, but its population was predominantly Croatian and Catholic, making an attack on it clearly contrary to the stated objectives of the crusade. Moreover, the King of Hungary, who had extended his protection to Zara, had himself taken the cross and was technically a fellow crusader, making any attack on his territories a violation of the fundamental principles of the crusading movement. The debate over the Zara proposal revealed the complex tensions within the crusading army and the competing interests that had shaped the expedition from its inception. The great nobles who led the crusade were caught between their obligations to the Church and their practical need to find some means of proceeding with their holy war. The lesser nobles and knights who made up the bulk of the army were primarily concerned with the immediate problem of their transportation to the Holy Land, while the common soldiers and pilgrims who had joined the expedition out of religious conviction were increasingly confused and demoralized by the political complexities that had emerged. The papal response to the Zara proposal was swift and unambiguous, with Pope Innocent III explicitly forbidding any attack on fellow Christians and threatening to excommunicate any crusaders who participated in such an action. The papal legate who delivered this message to the crusading army in Venice emphasized that the Holy War could only be conducted against infidels and that any violence against Christians would corrupt the spiritual purposes of the expedition. However, the practical reality of the situation made papal opposition largely irrelevant, as the Crusaders had no alternative means of reaching the Holy Land and no resources to return to their homes. The decision to proceed with the attack on Zara was made in a series of councils that involved the crusading leadership, Venetian officials, and representatives of the various contingents that made up the army. The arguments in favor of the attack emphasized the practical necessity of clearing the debt to Venice and the impossibility of proceeding with the crusade without Venetian cooperation. The opponents of the attack, led by various clerical figures and some nobles who were particularly concerned about papal approval, argued that the spiritual benefits of the crusade would be lost if the army participated in an attack on fellow Christians. The final decision to attack Zara represented a triumph of practical politics over religious principle, marking the first crucial step in the transformation of the Fourth Crusade from a holy war against Islam into a commercial and political venture that would ultimately target the Byzantine Empire. The agreement reached between the crusading leaders and Venice established a precedent for the subordination of religious objectives to practical necessities, while the willingness of the army to act against papal instructions demonstrated the extent to which the expedition had already moved beyond the control of the Church that had originally sponsored it. The preparations for the attack on Zara occupied the remainder of the summer of 1202, as the Venetian fleet was readied for departure and the crusading army was reorganized for what would be its first military operation. The excitement and anticipation that had characterized the army's arrival in Venice gave way to a more complex mixture of enthusiasm and apprehension, as the Crusaders prepared to embark on an enterprise that bore little resemblance to the holy war they had originally envisioned. The great fleet that assembled in the Venetian lagoon represented one of the largest maritime expeditions of the medieval period, with over 200 ships of various sizes carrying men, horses, supplies, and the siege equipment necessary for the reduction of a fortified city. The departure from Venice in early October 1202 was marked by elaborate ceremonies that combined religious blessing with political theater, as Doge Dandolo and the crusading leaders sought to maintain the appearance of a holy war while pursuing objectives that were fundamentally secular. The blessing of the fleet by Venetian clergy, conducted according to ancient traditions that linked the Republic's maritime ventures to divine providence, provided a religious veneer for what was essentially a commercial and political enterprise. The sight of hundreds of ships bearing the cross alongside the banners of Venice and the various crusading contingents created a powerful visual spectacle that impressed both participants and observers, masking the fundamental contradictions that would ultimately doom the expedition. The voyage to Zara proceeded without significant incident, as the Venetian navigators demonstrated their mastery of Adriatic conditions and their ability to coordinate the movements of a large fleet across several hundred miles of open water. The crossing took approximately 5 days, during which the Crusaders had their first taste of the hardships and uncertainties that would characterize their entire expedition. The overcrowded ships, the constant threat of storms, and the challenge of maintaining supplies for thousands of men and horses provided a foretaste of the logistical difficulties that would plague the crusade throughout its duration. The arrival of the crusading fleet before Zara on October 10, 1202, marked the beginning of one of the most controversial episodes in the entire history of the crusading movement. The city, situated on a peninsula jutting into the Adriatic Sea, was strongly fortified and defended by a population that had no intention of surrendering to what they correctly perceived as a Venetian attempt to restore their lost dominance over the Dalmatian coast. The walls of Zara, built of local stone and reinforced over generations of conflict, presented a formidable obstacle to any attacking force, while the city's position on the sea provided opportunities for resupply and reinforcement that could prolong a siege indefinitely. The initial approach to Zara was marked by attempts at negotiation, as both the crusading leaders and the Venetians recognized that a prolonged siege would consume resources that were needed for the eventual voyage to the Holy Land. The terms offered to the city were relatively generous, including guarantees of personal safety and property rights for the population in exchange for submission to Venetian authority. However, these negotiations were complicated by the presence of papal legates, who continued to insist that any attack on fellow Christians would result in excommunication, creating a situation where the Crusaders were simultaneously threatening the city and being threatened by their own church. The response of the Zorans to these overtures was defiant and carefully calculated to exploit the divisions within the crusading army. The city's leaders, recognizing that their best hope lay in emphasizing the religious impropriety of the attack, sent messages to the crusading camp that emphasized their Christian faith and their loyalty to the Pope. They displayed crosses on their walls and organized religious processions that were visible to the besieging army, creating a powerful visual reminder of the contradiction between the Crusaders' religious objectives and their current military actions. These demonstrations had a significant effect on the morale of the crusading army, particularly among the common soldiers and pilgrims who had joined the expedition primarily for religious reasons. The siege of Zara officially began on October 11, 1202, when the crusading army disembarked and began the construction of the camps, siege works, and assault equipment necessary for the reduction of the city. The organization of the siege reflected the complex command structure that had emerged within the crusading army, with Venetian engineers and naval personnel working alongside French and German knights and sergeants under the overall direction of the crusading leadership. The construction of siege engines, including catapults, battering rams, and siege towers, required the cooperation of craftsmen and laborers from both the crusading army and the Venetian fleet, creating a temporary community focused on the single objective of capturing the city. The technical challenges of the siege were considerable, as the defenders of Zara had prepared their city for attack by strengthening the walls, stockpiling supplies, and organizing the population for defense. The city's position on a peninsula made it difficult to achieve a complete blockade, while the strength of the fortifications meant that any assault would require extensive preparation and coordination. The Crusaders and Venetians responded to these challenges by employing the most advanced siege techniques of the period, including the systematic undermining of wall sections, the construction of mobile protective shelters for attacking troops, and the use of naval forces to prevent resupply from the sea. The progress of the siege was marked by daily skirmishes and assaults that gradually wore down the defenders while demonstrating the military effectiveness of the crusading army. The coordination between Venetian naval forces and the land-based siege works proved particularly effective, as the Republic's ships were able to control the harbor and prevent any relief expeditions from reaching the city. The psychological impact of the siege on the defenders was intensified by the evident determination of the attackers and the sophisticated nature of their siege works, which suggested that the city's fall was only a matter of time. However, the siege also revealed the deep divisions within the crusading army and the growing conflict between religious and secular objectives that would characterize the entire expedition. Many of the Crusaders, particularly those from regions where papal authority was most respected, were increasingly uncomfortable with their participation in an attack on fellow Christians. The presence of papal legates who continued to threaten excommunication created a situation where the Crusaders were forced to choose between their immediate practical needs and their long-term spiritual welfare. This tension was exacerbated by the arrival of additional papal messages that made increasingly explicit the Pope's opposition to the attack and his intention to punish those who participated in it. The papal response to the siege of Zara was swift and uncompromising, reflecting Pope Innocent III's determination to maintain control over the crusading movement and his genuine horror at the prospect of Christian armies attacking fellow Christians. The Pope's letters to the crusading leaders, delivered by special messengers who risked their lives to reach the army, emphasized that the holy war could only be conducted against infidels and that any violence against Christians would corrupt the spiritual purposes of the expedition. The threat of excommunication was not merely a diplomatic maneuver but a genuine spiritual sanction that would have serious consequences for those who ignored it. The reaction of the crusading army to these papal warnings was complex and varied, reflecting the diverse motivations and backgrounds of those who had joined the expedition. The great nobles who led the crusade were generally more concerned with practical considerations than with papal approval, recognizing that their primary obligation was to their followers and to the success of the expedition. Many of these leaders had invested enormous resources in the crusade and could not afford to abandon it without achieving some tangible results. The lesser nobles and knights who made up the bulk of the army were divided between those who shared their leaders' practical concerns and those who were genuinely troubled by the prospect of papal excommunication. The common soldiers and pilgrims who had joined the expedition primarily for religious reasons were the most affected by the papal warnings, as their participation in the crusade was motivated primarily by the promise of spiritual rewards. Many of these individuals had made enormous sacrifices to join the expedition, selling their possessions and leaving their families in the hope of earning salvation through service to the cross. The prospect of excommunication threatened to nullify these spiritual benefits and transform their sacrifices into meaningless suffering. The result was a gradual erosion of morale and unity within the crusading army that would have lasting consequences for the entire expedition. The Venetian response to the papal opposition was characteristically pragmatic and showed little concern for the spiritual implications of the attack. Doge Dandolo and the other Venetian leaders recognized that their primary obligation was to the commercial and political interests of their republic, and they were prepared to accept papal disapproval if it was the price of achieving their objectives. The Venetians had invested enormous resources in the crusade and had suspended most normal commercial activities to fulfill their obligations under the treaty with the Crusaders. The loss of these investments would have been a severe blow to the Venetian economy and would have undermined the Republic's position in the competitive world of Mediterranean commerce. The siege of Zara continued throughout October and into November 1202, with the attacking forces gradually tightening their grip on the city, while the defenders mounted increasingly desperate resistance. The technical aspects of the siege demonstrated the advanced military capabilities that had been developed by both the crusading armies and the Italian maritime republics. The use of sophisticated siege engines, coordinated assaults by land and sea, and systematic approaches to undermining fortifications showed that medieval warfare had evolved far beyond the simple cavalry charges that had characterized earlier military operations. The final assault on Zara began on November 15, 1202, when the crusading army launched a coordinated attack on multiple sections of the city's walls. The assault was preceded by intensive bombardment from catapults and other siege engines, which had succeeded in creating several breaches in the fortifications. The attacking forces, organized into carefully coordinated units, advanced under cover of protective shelters while naval forces attempted to force the harbor. The defenders, recognizing that their situation was hopeless, concentrated their remaining forces at the most threatened points while preparing for the inevitable street fighting that would follow the wall's collapse. The breakthrough came when Venetian engineers succeeded in undermining a crucial section of the wall, creating a gap large enough to allow a general assault. The storming of the breach was led by a mixed force of Venetian Marines and French knights, whose coordinated advance overwhelmed the depleted defenders. The fighting within the city was brief but intense, as the defenders made a final stand in the central square before being forced to surrender. The capture of Zara was complete by the evening of November 15, 1202, marking the first major military success of the Fourth Crusade and the first step in its transformation from a holy war into a commercial and political venture. The immediate aftermath of Zara's capture was marked by tensions between the crusading army and their Venetian partners over the distribution of plunder and the treatment of the conquered population. The Venetians, as the primary beneficiaries of the city's capture, sought to establish immediate control over the commercial and administrative functions that would restore their dominance over the Dalmatian coast. The Crusaders, many of whom had participated in the siege with great reluctance, demanded their share of the plunder and sought to minimize their involvement in the ongoing occupation of the city. The treatment of Zara's population following the city's capture reflected the complex legal and moral questions that surrounded the entire operation. The inhabitants of the city, as Christians who had been conquered by fellow Christians, occupied an ambiguous position that had no clear precedent in crusading law or practice. The Venetians sought to treat them as rebels who had forfeited their rights through their resistance to legitimate authority, while many of the Crusaders argued that they should be treated as fellow Christians who deserved protection and respect. The compromise that emerged involved the protection of the population's lives and basic property rights, while allowing the systematic confiscation of the city's commercial assets and strategic resources. The papal response to the fall of Zara was immediate and severe, with Pope Innocent III issuing a formal excommunication of all those who had participated in the attack. The papal bull that announced this decision emphasized that the Crusaders had violated the fundamental principles of the Holy War and had corrupted their spiritual mission through their attack on fellow Christians. The excommunication was not merely a diplomatic gesture but a genuine spiritual sanction that theoretically cut the Crusaders off from the sacraments and the promise of salvation that had motivated their participation in the expedition. However, the practical impact of the excommunication was limited by the complex realities of medieval politics and the Crusaders' distance from papal authority. Many of the crusading leaders argued that their attack on Zara had been justified by necessity and that their ultimate objective of reaching the Holy Land would earn them divine forgiveness. The army's chaplains, caught between their loyalty to the Pope and their obligation to their military commanders, developed various theological arguments that minimized the spiritual consequences of the excommunication while allowing the expedition to continue. The winter of 1202 to 1203, which the crusading army spent in the captured city of Zara, was marked by increasing tensions and the emergence of new plans that would ultimately lead to the attack on Constantinople. The prolonged stay in Zara provided opportunities for reflection and planning that allowed the expedition's leaders to consider alternatives to the original objective of reaching the Holy Land. The practical difficulties of continuing the voyage to Egypt or Syria, combined with the enormous financial obligations that the Crusaders had incurred, created a situation where new objectives began to seem both necessary and attractive. It was during this winter sojourn in Zara that the crusading leaders were approached by representatives of Alexios Angelos, the exiled Byzantine prince who would ultimately provide the justification for the attack on Constantinople. The prince's proposal, which involved the restoration of his father Isaac II to the Byzantine throne in exchange for substantial financial and military support for the crusade, offered a solution to the expedition's financial problems while providing a religious justification for what would otherwise have been a purely commercial venture. The negotiations that followed would transform the Fourth Crusade from a misguided attack on a Christian city into a full-scale assault on the Byzantine Empire itself. The decision to accept Alexios Angelos's proposal was not made lightly, as it involved the crusading army in the complex politics of the Byzantine Empire and committed them to objectives that were even further removed from their original mission than the attack on Zara had been. The debates within the crusading leadership revealed the extent to which practical considerations had come to dominate religious objectives, while the enthusiastic support of the Venetians for the new plan demonstrated their recognition that an attack on Constantinople would serve their commercial interests far better than a voyage to the Holy Land ever could. The young man who would ultimately provide the justification for the Fourth Crusade's assault on Constantinople was Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Byzantine Emperor Isaac II. His story began in the labyrinthine politics of the Byzantine court, where palace coups and fraternal betrayals had become almost routine features of imperial succession. Isaac II Angelos had ruled the Byzantine Empire from 1185 to 1195, a period marked by military defeats, economic decline, and the gradual erosion of imperial authority that characterized the empire's final centuries. His reign had been plagued by constant rebellions, disastrous military campaigns, and the growing influence of foreign merchants who gradually took control of the empire's most lucrative commercial activities. The coup that brought Alexios III to power in 1195 was typical of Byzantine political practice, combining personal ambition with genuine concerns about the empire's declining fortunes. Alexios III, Isaac's own brother, had justified his seizure of power by pointing to Isaac's military failures and his inability to address the empire's mounting financial crisis. The new emperor had Isaac blinded according to Byzantine custom, a punishment that was intended to prevent any future attempts at restoration while demonstrating the finality of the political transition. Young Alexios, Isaac's son, had initially been spared this fate due to his youth and apparent political insignificance, but his very existence represented a potential threat to his uncle's legitimacy. The escape of young Alexios from Constantinople in 1201 was a carefully planned operation that involved loyal supporters of his father's regime and demonstrated the continuing instability of Byzantine politics. The prince's flight was facilitated by a network of nobles and court officials who had remained loyal to Isaac II and who saw the restoration of the legitimate dynasty as a means of addressing the empire's continuing decline. The young man's journey to the west was not merely a quest for personal restoration, but represented a broader attempt to forge new alliances that might strengthen the Byzantine Empire against its various enemies. The proposal that Alexios Angelos presented to the crusading leaders during the winter of 1202 to 1203 was both ambitious and desperate, reflecting his understanding of both Western political culture and his own precarious position. The prince offered to provide the crusading army with 200,000 silver marks, enough to clear their debt to Venice and finance their eventual voyage to the Holy Land. In addition, he promised to supply 10,000 Byzantine soldiers for the crusade and to maintain 500 knights in the Holy Land for the duration of the expedition. Most significantly for the long-term implications of the agreement, Alexios promised to bring the Byzantine Church back into communion with Rome, ending the schism that had divided Eastern and Western Christianity for over a century. These promises were extraordinary in their scope and reflected either remarkable naivety or calculated desperation on the part of the young prince. The financial commitments alone would have strained the resources of the Byzantine Empire even at the height of its power, while the promise of church reunion ignored the deep theological and cultural differences that had developed between East and West over centuries of separation. The military support that Alexios offered would have required the cooperation of a Byzantine army that had already demonstrated its unreliability through repeated defeats and defections. The reaction of the crusading leaders to Alexios's proposal was initially mixed, reflecting both the attractiveness of the offered terms and the recognition that accepting them would involve the expedition in Byzantine politics in ways that might prove difficult to control. The great nobles who led the crusade were experienced in the complex negotiations that characterized medieval diplomacy, and they recognized that the prince's promises might be easier to make than to fulfill. However, the immediate financial benefits of the agreement, combined with the religious justification it provided for what would otherwise have been a purely secular enterprise, made it difficult to reject. The Venetian response to the proposal was enthusiastic and immediate, reflecting Doge Dandelo's recognition that an expedition to Constantinople would serve Venetian commercial interests far better than the originally planned voyage to the Holy Land. The old Doge, whose long life had been shaped by Venice's complex relationship with the Byzantine Empire, saw in Alexios's proposal an opportunity to settle old scores while advancing his republic's commercial dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. The massacre of Latins in Constantinople in 1182, during which thousands of Western merchants had been killed, remained a vivid memory for Venetians of Dandelo's generation, while the empire's subsequent attempts to limit Venetian commercial privileges had created ongoing tensions that could only be resolved through political change. The negotiations that led to the formal agreement between Alexios Angelos and the crusading leaders were conducted with great secrecy, as all parties recognized that the plan would be controversial both within the crusading army and in the broader Christian world. The treaty that emerged from these discussions was carefully worded to emphasize the religious and political justifications for the expedition while minimizing the appearance of aggression against fellow Christians. The agreement portrayed the proposed attack on Constantinople as a restoration of legitimate authority and a reunification of the Christian Church rather than as a conquest of a Christian empire. The departure from Zara in the spring of 1203 marked the beginning of the final phase of the Fourth Crusade's transformation from a holy war into a commercial and political venture. The fleet that sailed from the Dalmatian coast carried not only the crusading army but also the apparatus of conquest, including siege engines, administrative personnel, and the diplomatic representatives who would attempt to legitimize the enterprise. The voyage to Constantinople proceeded through the familiar waters of the Adriatic and Mediterranean, with the Venetian navigators demonstrating their mastery of the routes that had connected Venice with the Byzantine Empire for centuries. The arrival of the crusading fleet in the Bosphorus in late June 1203 marked the beginning of one of the most dramatic confrontations in medieval history. The sight of over 200 Western ships approaching the greatest city in the Eastern Christian world created a spectacle that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe adequately. The crusading fleet, with its forest of masts and sails bearing the crosses and banners of Western Europe, represented a concentration of naval power that had never before been seen in Byzantine waters. The psychological impact of this display was enormous, both for the Crusaders who were seeing Constantinople for the first time and for the Byzantine population who watched their approach with growing alarm. The first view of Constantinople from the sea was an experience that impressed even the most traveled and sophisticated members of the crusading army. The city's position on its triangular peninsula, protected by water on two sides and by the massive land wall on the third, created a natural fortress that seemed almost impregnable. The great dome of Hagia Sophia, rising above the city's 7 hills, dominated a skyline that was dotted with hundreds of other churches, monasteries, and public buildings. The imperial palace complex, with its gardens and elaborate architecture, demonstrated the wealth and sophistication of Byzantine civilization, while the great hippodrome and other public spaces showed the scale of urban life that had developed over centuries of imperial rule. The economic activity that the Crusaders observed as they approached the city provided clear evidence of Constantinople's continuing importance as a commercial center. The harbor of the Golden Horn was filled with ships from throughout the Mediterranean world, while the docks and warehouses along the waterfront showed the scale of commercial activity that had made the city wealthy. The sight of this prosperity was particularly significant for the Venetians, who recognized that control of Constantinople would provide access to trade routes and commercial privileges that could transform their republic's economic position. The initial approach to Constantinople was marked by careful reconnaissance and diplomatic overtures designed to assess the city's defenses and the political situation within the empire. The crusading leaders, recognizing that their enterprise would succeed or fail based on their ability to present themselves as liberators rather than conquerors, sent envoys to the city with messages emphasizing their support for the restoration of Isaac II and their desire to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. These diplomatic initiatives were conducted with great ceremony and according to Byzantine protocol, as the Crusaders sought to demonstrate their respect for imperial traditions while asserting their political objectives. The response of Emperor Alexios III to the arrival of the crusading fleet was characteristically indecisive and demonstrated the political weaknesses that had plagued his reign from its beginning. The emperor, faced with the most serious external threat to his capital since the Arab sieges of the 7th and 8th centuries, proved incapable of mounting an effective defense or negotiating a satisfactory compromise. His initial reaction was to send diplomatic representatives to the crusading fleet with messages that attempted to dissuade the expedition from its objectives while avoiding any appearance of weakness or capitulation. The diplomatic exchanges that followed the Crusaders' arrival revealed the fundamental incompatibility between the two sides' objectives and expectations. The Byzantine negotiators, operating according to centuries of diplomatic tradition, sought to resolve the crisis through the complex negotiations and face-saving compromises that had characterized imperial foreign policy. They offered financial inducements, commercial concessions, and religious accommodations that might have satisfied the Crusaders' stated objectives while preserving the essential structure of imperial authority. However, these offers were insufficient to address the financial obligations that the Crusaders had incurred or to satisfy the Venetian desire for a fundamental restructuring of the empire's commercial relationships. The crusading response to these diplomatic overtures was carefully calculated to maintain the appearance of reasonableness while advancing their military objectives. The expedition's leaders emphasized their support for the restoration of Isaac II and young Alexios, portraying their demands as matters of justice and legitimacy rather than conquest. They presented detailed accounts of Alexios III's usurpation and the suffering of the legitimate emperor, creating a narrative that justified their intervention while minimizing the appearance of aggression against fellow Christians. The reaction of Constantinople's population to the arrival of the crusading fleet was complex and varied, reflecting the diverse composition of the city's inhabitants and their different experiences with Western Europeans. The Greek population, which formed the majority of the city's residents, was generally hostile to the Western expedition, viewing it as a threat to their religious and cultural identity. The memories of the massacre of Latins in 1182 remained vivid, but these events were now remembered as evidence of the dangers posed by Western influence rather than as justification for Western revenge. The city's Latin population, consisting primarily of merchants and craftsmen from the Italian maritime republics, found themselves in an impossible position between their ethnic and commercial ties to the West and their integration into Byzantine society. Many of these individuals had lived in Constantinople for generations and had developed strong attachments to the city and its institutions. The arrival of the crusading fleet forced them to choose between their loyalty to their adopted home and their connections to their countries of origin, a choice that would have profound consequences for their future security and prosperity. The religious communities within Constantinople, including the numerous monasteries and churches that gave the city its sacred character, were particularly concerned about the implications of Western intervention. The proposed reunion of the Eastern and Western churches, which formed a central element of young Alexios's promises to the Crusaders, was viewed with deep suspicion by many Byzantine clergy who recognized that such a reunion would likely involve the subordination of Eastern traditions to Western authority. The theological and liturgical differences between the two churches, which had developed over centuries of separation, could not be easily resolved through political agreements. The military preparations that accompanied these diplomatic exchanges demonstrated the seriousness of the threat facing Constantinople and the inadequacy of the empire's defenses. The city's walls, while still formidable, had not been seriously tested for centuries and required maintenance and reinforcement that the imperial government was ill-equipped to provide. The imperial army, weakened by years of defeats and reduced by financial constraints, was insufficient to defend the enormous perimeter that surrounded the city. The navy, which had once been the pride of the Byzantine Empire, had been reduced to a small force of aging ships that could not hope to challenge the Venetian fleet. The defensive preparations that Alexios III ordered in response to the crusading threat revealed both the empire's continuing capabilities and its fundamental weaknesses. The emperor ordered the strengthening of the seawall that protected the city from naval attack, while additional troops were summoned from the empire's remaining provinces. The great chain that protected the entrance to the Golden Horn was reinforced and prepared for deployment, while the city's arsenal was inventoried and additional weapons were distributed to the civilian population. However, these measures were largely cosmetic and could not address the fundamental problems of imperial weakness and popular demoralization that had been developing for decades. The psychological impact of the crusading threat on Constantinople's population was profound and lasting, creating a sense of vulnerability and betrayal that would influence Byzantine attitudes toward the West for generations. The sight of Christian armies approaching their city with hostile intentions challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of Christian solidarity and the role of the Byzantine Empire as the protector of Eastern Christianity. The realization that their emperor was unable to defend them effectively undermined confidence in imperial authority and created conditions that would facilitate the city's eventual capture. The final diplomatic exchanges before the commencement of hostilities involved increasingly desperate attempts by both sides to find some accommodation that might avoid the catastrophic consequences of a prolonged siege. The Byzantine negotiators, recognizing that their military position was hopeless, offered increasingly generous terms that included substantial financial payments and commercial concessions. The crusading leaders, while maintaining their stated objectives, showed some flexibility in their demands and timeline, recognizing that a negotiated settlement might be preferable to a costly siege. However, these diplomatic efforts were ultimately unsuccessful due to the fundamental incompatibility between the two sides' minimum requirements. The Crusaders could not abandon their support for young Alexios without losing their justification for the entire enterprise, while Alexios III could not abdicate in favor of his nephew without accepting the complete failure of his reign. The Venetians, whose commercial interests would be best served by a fundamental restructuring of the empire's political and economic systems, had little incentive to accept any settlement that preserved the existing order. The breakdown of negotiations in early July 1203 marked the beginning of the military phase of the Fourth Crusade's intervention in Byzantine affairs. The crusading army, having exhausted the possibilities of diplomacy, began the systematic preparation for siege warfare that would ultimately result in the capture of Constantinople and the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. The failure of these final diplomatic efforts represented not merely a breakdown in communication but a fundamental clash between incompatible worldviews and irreconcilable interests that could only be resolved through force. The siege of Constantinople began on July 5, 1203, with the systematic deployment of the crusading army around the city's defensive perimeter. The military challenges facing the attackers were enormous, as Constantinople's position and fortifications had been developed over centuries specifically to repel such assaults. The city's triangular peninsula was protected by water on two sides, with the Sea of Marmara to the south and the Golden Horn to the north, leaving only the western approach vulnerable to land attack. The famous land wall, stretching approximately 4 miles from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara, consisted of a complex system of inner and outer walls, towers, and defensive positions that had successfully repelled every attack for over 8 centuries. The crusading strategy that emerged from the expedition's war councils reflected both the technical expertise of the Venetian naval forces and the siege warfare experience of the French and German knights. The plan called for a coordinated assault on multiple fronts, with the Venetian fleet attacking the seawall that protected the city from naval assault, while the land forces concentrated their efforts on the most vulnerable sections of the western fortifications. This approach recognized that the city's defenses were strongest where they had been most frequently tested, and that success would require the coordination of land and naval forces in ways that had rarely been attempted in medieval warfare. The positioning of the crusading army around Constantinople's land wall was a massive logistical undertaking that required the coordination of thousands of men, hundreds of siege engines, and vast quantities of supplies across several miles of difficult terrain. The Crusaders established their main camp on the heights overlooking the Golden Horn, a position that provided both strategic advantages and symbolic significance. From this elevated position, the attackers could observe the entire city and coordinate their various assault operations, while the sight of their banners and pavilions served as a constant reminder to the Byzantine population of the threat they faced. The construction of siege works around Constantinople required engineering expertise that pushed the limits of medieval military technology. The Crusaders and their Venetian allies employed the most advanced siege techniques of the period, including the systematic undermining of wall sections, the construction of massive siege towers, and the deployment of catapults and other artillery pieces. The famous mangonels and trebuchets that were assembled during the siege represented the culmination of centuries of military engineering development, capable of hurling stones weighing several hundred pounds with sufficient force to breach even the strongest fortifications. The sea wall that protected Constantinople from naval attack had been designed primarily to repel ships attempting to land troops or supplies, but it had not been constructed to withstand the kind of systematic assault that the Venetian fleet was preparing to deliver. The Venetians, drawing on their extensive experience in naval warfare and their detailed knowledge of the city's defenses, developed innovative tactics that combined traditional naval assault techniques with adaptations specifically designed for the unique challenges of attacking Constantinople. The preparation of the Venetian fleet for the assault on the seawall involved the modification of existing ships and the construction of specialized assault platforms that could approach the wall while providing protection for the attacking forces. The first major assault on Constantinople began on July 6, 1203, with a coordinated attack by both land and naval forces that tested the city's defenses at multiple points simultaneously. The land assault focused on the section of the western wall near the Gate of Chrysius, where previous reconnaissance had identified weaknesses in the fortifications. The attacking forces, organized into carefully coordinated units, advanced under cover of protective shields and mobile shelters, while siege engines provided covering fire. The defenders, commanded by experienced Byzantine officers and supported by the city's militia, mounted fierce resistance that demonstrated both their courage and their determination to defend their city. The naval assault that accompanied the land attack was led by Doge Dandolo himself, who despite his advanced age and blindness insisted on personally directing the most dangerous phase of the operation. The Venetian fleet, arranged in a formation that maximized their ability to coordinate their assault, while minimizing their vulnerability to defensive fire, approached the seawall with methodical precision. The ships had been modified with raised platforms and protective barriers that allowed archers and siege engineers to work effectively while under enemy fire, while specially constructed assault bridges enabled troops to transfer directly from the ships to the wall. The defense of the seawall was hampered by the Byzantine navy's weakness and the limited number of troops available for this sector of the city's perimeter. The imperial fleet, consisting of fewer than 20 ships of various sizes, was vastly outnumbered by the Venetian force and lacked the specialized equipment necessary for defensive operations. The troops defending the seawall, while brave and determined, were spread too thinly across the extensive waterfront to provide effective resistance at all points, creating opportunities for the attackers to concentrate their forces at vulnerable locations. The breakthrough came when Venetian engineers succeeded in establishing a foothold on the seawall near the imperial palace complex. The assault was led by a small group of Venetian nobles and experienced marines who managed to scale the wall and establish a defensive position that could be reinforced by additional troops. The fighting on the wall was fierce and close quarters, with swords, spears, and crossbows being used at ranges where individual skill and courage were decisive factors. The sight of Venetian banners flying from the seawall had an enormous psychological impact on both the attackers and the defenders, as it demonstrated that the city's supposedly impregnable defenses could indeed be breached. The expansion of the Venetian foothold on the seawall was achieved through a combination of systematic assault and tactical innovation that demonstrated the superior military organization of the attacking forces. Additional troops were transferred from the fleet to the captured section of the wall, while siege engines were repositioned to provide covering fire for the expanding perimeter. The Venetians employed portable bridges and scaling ladders to extend their control along the wall, while combat engineers worked to create permanent breaches that could accommodate larger numbers of troops. The Byzantine response to the loss of the seawall was swift but poorly coordinated, reflecting the command problems that had plagued the empire's military efforts throughout the crisis. Emperor Alexios III ordered counterattacks designed to retake the captured sections of the wall, but these efforts were hampered by confusion about the extent of the Venetian penetration and disagreements among the military commanders about the best tactical approach. The troops available for the counterattacks were drawn from various units and lacked the unified command structure necessary for effective coordination. The fire that began in the area behind the seawall during the height of the battle added another dimension of chaos to an already complex military situation. The blaze, which may have been started accidentally during the fighting or deliberately as a defensive measure, spread rapidly through the densely packed buildings of the commercial district. The fire created enormous clouds of smoke that obscured visibility and made coordination difficult for both sides, while the heat and flames forced both attackers and defenders to evacuate certain areas of the battlefield. The psychological impact of the fire was perhaps even more significant than its immediate military effects, as it demonstrated to the city's population that their defenses had been decisively breached. The expansion of Venetian control along the seawall continued throughout the day despite fierce Byzantine resistance and the complications created by the fire. The attackers employed systematic tactics that combined direct assault with siege warfare techniques, gradually extending their perimeter while consolidating their gains. The establishment of supply lines from the fleet to the captured sections of the wall enabled the Venetians to maintain their offensive pressure while providing the logistical support necessary for sustained operations. The political implications of the military situation became apparent as reports of the seawall's capture spread throughout the city. The civilian population, already demoralized by months of economic hardship and political uncertainty, began to question whether continued resistance was worthwhile. The sight of Western banners flying from the city's defenses and the smoke rising from the burning districts created a sense of impending doom that undermined popular support for the emperor's war effort. The merchants and craftsmen who had the most to lose from a prolonged siege began to advocate for negotiations, while the religious communities worried about the fate of the city's churches and monasteries. The crisis reached its climax on the evening of July 17, 1203, when Emperor Alexios III made the fateful decision to abandon his capital rather than continue a defense that appeared increasingly hopeless. The emperor's flight was precipitated by reports that the Venetians had established a secure foothold within the city and that additional crusading forces were preparing to assault the land wall. The political calculations that led to this decision reflected both the emperor's recognition of his military situation and his fear of the consequences of capture by the Western forces. The emperor's escape from Constantinople was accomplished under cover of darkness and involved a small group of loyal supporters who shared his assessment of the military situation. The imperial party, traveling with a minimal escort and carrying only the most portable of the imperial treasures, made their way through the city streets to a small harbor where boats were waiting to transport them to safety. The secrecy surrounding the emperor's departure was necessary to prevent panic among the remaining defenders and to avoid giving the attackers advance warning of the change in leadership. The discovery of the emperor's flight on the morning of July 18, 1203, created a political vacuum that the city's remaining leaders struggled to fill. The senior military commanders, faced with the collapse of central authority and the continuing Western assault, were forced to make immediate decisions about whether to continue the defense or to seek terms with the attackers. The civilian leadership, consisting primarily of wealthy merchants and prominent citizens, recognized that continued resistance would likely result in a general assault that would devastate the city. The emergence of young Alexios Angelos as a claimant to the imperial throne provided the city's leaders with a potential solution to their political crisis. The prince, whose promises to the Crusaders had provided the original justification for the expedition, was presented to the Byzantine leadership as a legitimate ruler who could negotiate acceptable terms with the Western forces. The support that young Alexios received from various factions within the city reflected not so much enthusiasm for his leadership as recognition that he represented the best available option for avoiding a catastrophic siege. The liberation of Isaac II from his imprisonment in the imperial palace was accomplished by a group of court officials and nobles who recognized that the restoration of the legitimate dynasty provided the best hope for political stability. The blind former emperor, who had been held in captivity for nearly 8 years, was brought before the assembled court and proclaimed as the rightful ruler of the Byzantine Empire. The ceremony of restoration, hastily organized in the throne room of the Great Palace, attempted to provide legal and religious legitimacy for the political changes that were occurring. The negotiation of a cessation of hostilities between the restored imperial government and the crusading forces required delicate diplomacy that took into account the complex interests of all parties involved. The crusading leaders, having achieved their stated objective of restoring Isaac II and young Alexios to the throne, were willing to halt their military operations in exchange for the fulfillment of the promises that had been made to them. The Venetians, while satisfied with their military success, were particularly interested in securing the commercial concessions that would justify their investment in the expedition. The terms of the agreement that ended the first siege of Constantinople reflected the military realities of the situation and the political necessities facing the restored imperial government. The Crusaders agreed to halt their attacks and to recognize the legitimacy of Isaac II and young Alexios as co-emperors, while the Byzantine side confirmed the promises that had been made regarding financial support for the crusade and the reunion of the Eastern and Western churches. The agreement also included provisions for the withdrawal of the crusading army from the immediate vicinity of the city, reducing the psychological pressure on the population while maintaining the Western forces' ability to intervene if necessary. The coronation of young Alexios as Alexios IV, co-emperor alongside his restored father, took place on August 1, 1203, in a ceremony that attempted to combine traditional Byzantine imperial rituals with acknowledgement of the changed political circumstances. The coronation was attended by representatives of the crusading army, creating an unprecedented situation where Western military leaders participated in the installation of a Byzantine emperor. The presence of these foreign observers at the most sacred ceremony of imperial legitimacy demonstrated the extent to which the empire's independence had been compromised by the events of the siege. The immediate aftermath of the restoration was marked by cautious optimism on both sides, as the Crusaders believed that their objectives had been achieved and the Byzantines hoped that the crisis had been resolved without the catastrophic consequences that had seemed inevitable during the height of the siege. The withdrawal of the crusading army from the immediate vicinity of Constantinople's walls reduced the sense of immediate threat, while the restoration of Isaac II provided a symbol of legitimacy that many hoped would stabilize the political situation. However, the underlying problems that had made the crisis possible remained unresolved, and the promises that had been made to secure the Crusaders' support would prove impossible to fulfill. The financial obligations that Alexios IV had assumed were far beyond the capacity of the impoverished imperial treasury, while the promised reunion of the churches faced enormous theological and cultural obstacles that could not be overcome through political agreements. The presence of the crusading army in the vicinity of Constantinople created a continuing source of tension and expense that the empire was ill-equipped to manage. The restoration of Isaac II and the coronation of Alexios IV represented not the resolution of the crisis but merely the end of its first phase. The fundamental incompatibility between the Crusaders' expectations and the empire's capabilities would soon become apparent, while the political instability that had made the crisis possible would continue to plague the restored government. The success of the first siege had demonstrated the vulnerability of Constantinople's defenses and the weakness of the imperial government, creating conditions that would lead inexorably to the final catastrophe that was yet to come. The months that followed the restoration would test whether the agreements that had been reached could be implemented in practice and whether the Byzantine Empire could survive the enormous strains that had been placed upon it. The crusading army, while temporarily satisfied with the political changes that had occurred, remained encamped in the vicinity of the capital, a constant reminder of the precarious nature of the new government's authority. The stage was set for the final act of the drama that would culminate in the destruction of the Byzantine Empire and the sack of Constantinople. The reign of Alexios IV, which began with such promise in August 1203, quickly revealed the fundamental impossibility of reconciling the emperor's obligations to the Crusaders with the political and economic realities of the Byzantine Empire. The young emperor, barely 20 years old and lacking any significant experience in imperial administration, found himself caught between the irreconcilable demands of his Western allies and the growing hostility of his own subjects. The promises that had seemed achievable during the desperate circumstances of his exile proved to be far beyond the capacity of even a legitimately restored emperor to fulfill. The financial obligations that Alexios IV had assumed in his treaty with the Crusaders represented the most immediate and pressing challenge facing the new government. The promised payment of 200,000 silver marks was equivalent to several years of the empire's total revenue, even under the most optimistic assumptions about tax collection and economic recovery. The imperial treasury, depleted by years of military expenses and administrative inefficiency, contained nowhere near the resources necessary to meet these obligations. The additional promise to provide 10,000 soldiers for the crusade and maintain 500 knights in the Holy Land would have required military expenditures that the empire simply could not afford. The attempts by Alexios IV to raise the necessary funds through increased taxation created the first serious crisis of his reign and demonstrated the depth of popular opposition to the Western alliance. The emperor's financial advisors, recognizing that normal tax collection would be insufficient to meet the Crusaders' demands, proposed extraordinary levies on both the church and the civilian population. These measures, while perhaps unavoidable given the emperor's commitments, were deeply unpopular among all segments of Byzantine society and created a growing sense that the restoration had brought not relief but additional burdens. The taxation of church property proved particularly controversial, as it violated centuries of tradition regarding the sanctity of religious institutions and their exemption from secular financial obligations. The monasteries and churches of Constantinople, which controlled vast wealth in the form of land, precious objects, and accumulated donations, were required to contribute significant portions of their treasures to meet the emperor's obligations to the Crusaders. The confiscation of sacred vessels, icon frames, and other religious artifacts created enormous resentment among the clergy and the general population, who viewed these actions as sacrilege. The resistance of the Byzantine Church to the proposed reunion with Rome, which formed another crucial element of Alexios IV's promises to the Crusaders, reflected deep theological and cultural differences that could not be resolved through political agreements. The Eastern clergy, led by the Patriarch of Constantinople, maintained that the doctrinal differences between the Eastern and Western churches were matters of fundamental principle that could not be compromised for political convenience. The proposed recognition of papal supremacy was particularly unacceptable to a clergy that had maintained its independence from Rome for centuries. The popular reaction to the emperor's religious policies demonstrated the extent to which the proposed church reunion was seen as a betrayal of Byzantine cultural identity. The common people of Constantinople, for whom the Orthodox faith represented not merely a religious commitment but a fundamental aspect of their ethnic and cultural distinctiveness, viewed the emperor's negotiations with Rome as evidence of his subordination to foreign interests. The sight of Latin clergy in the city's churches and the introduction of Western liturgical practices created a sense of cultural invasion that undermined popular support for the imperial government. The presence of the crusading army in the vicinity of Constantinople created a constant source of tension and expense that the empire was ill-equipped to manage. The thousands of Western soldiers, while technically allies of the emperor, represented a foreign military force whose continued presence was a reminder of the empire's weakness and dependence. The cost of supplying and maintaining these forces, which had been assumed by the imperial government as part of the agreement with the Crusaders, placed additional strains on the already overburdened treasury. The cultural conflicts that arose from the extended presence of Western forces in and around Constantinople reflected fundamental differences in customs, language, and religious practice that could not be easily resolved. The Western soldiers, many of whom had never experienced the sophisticated urban culture of the Byzantine capital, were often contemptuous of local customs and dismissive of Byzantine military capabilities. The frequent incidents of violence and disorder that occurred between Western soldiers and Byzantine civilians created a climate of mutual hostility that undermined the political alliance between the emperor and the Crusaders. The economic disruption caused by the prolonged crisis and the presence of foreign forces began to manifest itself in widespread shortages and inflation that affected all levels of society. The normal commercial activities that had sustained the city's prosperity were disrupted by the uncertainty surrounding the political situation and the diversion of resources to meet the emperor's obligations to the Crusaders. The merchants and craftsmen who formed the backbone of the city's economy found themselves increasingly unable to conduct normal business operations, while the costs of basic necessities rose dramatically. The emperor's desperate attempts to meet his financial obligations through the sale of imperial regalia and other treasures created additional controversy and demonstrated the extent of the government's financial crisis. The famous crown jewels and ceremonial objects that had been accumulated over centuries of imperial rule were systematically sold or pawned to raise cash for payments to the Crusaders. These actions, while perhaps necessary given the circumstances, were seen by many Byzantines as a fundamental betrayal of imperial dignity and a symbol of the empire's subjugation to foreign interests. The growing opposition to Alexios IV's policies began to coalesce around alternative political figures who offered different approaches to the crisis. The most prominent of these was Alexios Doukas, who later became known as Alexios V, a nobleman with extensive connections throughout the Byzantine aristocracy and the military establishment. Doukas and his supporters argued that the emperor's subservience to the Crusaders was both humiliating and ultimately futile, as the Western demands could never be fully satisfied and would only lead to additional impositions in the future. The organization of political opposition to Alexios IV was facilitated by the traditional networks of Byzantine court politics and the growing sense that the current policies were leading the empire toward disaster. The great noble families, who had historically competed for influence and position within the imperial system, found common ground in their opposition to the Western alliance and their desire to restore Byzantine independence. The military commanders, many of whom had been humiliated by the empire's defeat and the need to accommodate foreign forces, were particularly receptive to arguments for a more assertive policy. The urban population of Constantinople, suffering from the economic hardships caused by the prolonged crisis and resentful of the cultural impositions associated with the Western presence, provided a broader base of support for opposition to the emperor's policies. The guilds and professional associations that organized the city's economic life became centers of resistance to the imperial government, while the religious brotherhoods and charitable organizations that provided social services to the population offered alternative focuses of loyalty and identity. The emperor's increasing isolation from his own subjects was reflected in his growing dependence on the crusading army for protection and support. The imperial guard, traditionally the emperor's most reliable military force, became increasingly unreliable as its members were influenced by the general hostility to the Western alliance. The emperor's public appearances, once occasions for the display of imperial majesty and popular enthusiasm, became opportunities for demonstrations of opposition and expressions of discontent. The winter of 1203 to 1204 marked the beginning of the final crisis that would lead to the emperor's downfall and the resumption of hostilities with the Crusaders. The failure to meet the promised payments to the Western forces, combined with the evident unpopularity of the emperor's policies, created a situation where both sides began to prepare for the resumption of conflict. The crusading leaders, recognizing that their financial expectations were unlikely to be met, began to consider alternative approaches to achieving their objectives, while the emperor's opponents prepared to challenge his authority directly. The diplomatic efforts to resolve the growing crisis through modified agreements and extended payment schedules proved unsuccessful due to the fundamental incompatibility between the two sides' minimum requirements. The Crusaders, who had invested enormous resources in the expedition and incurred substantial debts to the Venetians, could not accept indefinite delays in the fulfillment of the emperor's promises. The emperor, facing growing opposition from his own subjects and lacking the resources to meet his obligations, was increasingly unable to make credible commitments to future payments. The series of incidents that occurred during the winter months gradually escalated the tensions between the Byzantine population and the Western forces into open hostility. The most serious of these incidents involved attacks on Western merchants and soldiers by Byzantine civilians, followed by retaliatory raids by crusading forces against Byzantine property. These violent confrontations, while initially limited in scope, created a cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation that made peaceful coexistence increasingly impossible. The emperor's attempts to mediate between his subjects and the crusaders demonstrated his impossible position and his decreasing ability to control events. His efforts to satisfy both sides simultaneously pleased neither, while his obvious weakness encouraged his opponents to consider more direct action. The emperor's public statements, which attempted to justify his policies while acknowledging the difficulties they had created, were perceived by many as evidence of his fundamental unsuitability for imperial leadership. The conspiracy that ultimately led to Alexios IV's overthrow began to take shape in January 1204, as various opposition groups recognized that their individual efforts were insufficient to challenge the emperor's authority. The coordination of these diverse factions required careful planning and the development of alternative political arrangements that could provide stability after the emperor's removal. The leadership of this conspiracy was assumed by Alexios Doukas, whose connections throughout the Byzantine establishment and his reputation for competence and decisiveness made him the natural choice for those seeking an alternative to the current government. The political program that emerged from the conspiracy reflected both the immediate need to address the crisis with the Crusaders and the broader desire to restore Byzantine independence and dignity. The conspirators proposed to repudiate the agreements with the Western forces and to expel them from Byzantine territory, while implementing internal reforms that would restore the empire's military and financial capabilities. This program, while appealing to those who resented the Western presence, ignored the practical difficulties of implementing such policies given the empire's military weakness and the presence of the crusading army. The final confrontation between Alexios IV and his opponents began on January 25, 1204, when the emperor's attempts to arrest the conspiracy's leaders precipitated a general uprising in Constantinople. The emperor's forces, weakened by defections and lacking popular support, were quickly overwhelmed by the opposition, which had prepared for this contingency through months of careful planning. The emperor's flight to the imperial palace, followed by his capture and imprisonment, marked the end of his brief and troubled reign. The murder of Alexios IV on February 8, 1204, was carried out by supporters of the new regime who recognized that the former emperor's continued existence represented a potential threat to the stability of the new government. The method of execution, strangulation with a bowstring according to Byzantine tradition, was chosen to avoid the shedding of royal blood while ensuring the former emperor's death. The announcement of Alexios IV's death to the crusading army marked the beginning of the final phase of the crisis that would lead to the sack of Constantinople. The reaction of the crusading leaders to the emperor's murder was swift and decisive, as they recognized that the new Byzantine government represented a fundamental threat to their interests and objectives. The repudiation of the agreements with the previous government, combined with the obvious hostility of the new regime, convinced the Crusaders that their only option was to pursue their objectives through direct military action. The preparations for the final assault on Constantinople began immediately, as both sides recognized that the political crisis had made further compromise impossible. The failure of Alexios IV's reign represented not merely a personal tragedy but a broader failure of the attempt to reconcile Eastern and Western Christian interests through political accommodation. The emperor's death marked the end of the last serious attempt to avoid the catastrophic confrontation that would destroy the Byzantine Empire and transform the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. The stage was now set for the final act of the Fourth Crusade, which would culminate in one of the most destructive events in medieval history. The harsh winter of 1203 to 1204 transformed Constantinople into a city under siege not only by foreign armies but by the relentless forces of political chaos and economic collapse. The Byzantine capital, which had endured countless crises over 8 centuries of imperial rule, faced a convergence of threats that would test the very foundations of its survival. The bitter cold that gripped the city during these months seemed to mirror the psychological climate of fear and uncertainty that had settled over the population, while the political upheavals that followed Alexios IV's murder created a power vacuum that ambitious men rushed to fill. The emergence of Alexios V. Doukas as the new Byzantine emperor was the result of a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that had been months in the making. Doukas, a member of one of the empire's most prominent noble families, had built his political career on a combination of military competence, aristocratic connections, and an acute understanding of the complex factional politics that characterized the Byzantine court. His rise to power represented not merely a personal triumph, but the victory of a political faction that was determined to restore Byzantine independence and dignity through confrontation with the Western invaders. The political program that Doukas brought to the imperial throne reflected a fundamental rejection of the accommodation policies that had characterized the previous government. The new emperor's supporters, drawn primarily from the military aristocracy and the urban population, demanded an end to the humiliating concessions that had been made to the Crusaders and the restoration of traditional Byzantine authority. This program, while appealing to those who resented the Western presence, ignored the practical realities of the empire's military weakness and the continued presence of the crusading army. The coronation of Alexios V. Doukas on February 5, 1204, was conducted with all the traditional ceremony and religious solemnity that characterized imperial inaugurations, but the circumstances surrounding the event were anything but normal. The ceremony took place in the Hagia Sophia before a congregation that included many of the empire's most powerful nobles and military commanders. But the absence of popular celebration reflected the grim realities of the situation. The new emperor's first public pronouncements emphasized his commitment to defending the empire against all foreign threats and his determination to restore Byzantine independence. The repudiation of the agreements with the Crusaders, which formed the cornerstone of the new government's policy, was announced through a series of official proclamations that left no doubt about the emperor's intentions. The financial obligations that had been assumed by the previous government were declared null and void, while the promises regarding church reunion and military cooperation were formally withdrawn. These actions, while popular among the Byzantine population, created an immediate crisis with the crusading army and made military confrontation virtually inevitable. The reaction of the crusading leaders to the new government's policies was swift and decisive, reflecting their recognition that negotiation was no longer possible and that their objectives could only be achieved through military force. The repudiation of the previous agreements not only threatened the Crusaders' immediate financial interests but also undermined the entire justification for their intervention in Byzantine affairs. The death of Alexios IV, whom they had supported as the legitimate emperor, removed any pretense of legitimacy for their continued presence in Byzantine territory. The diplomatic efforts that were undertaken during February and March 1204 to find some accommodation between the new government and the crusading army revealed the fundamental incompatibility between the two sides' positions. The Byzantine negotiators, operating under instructions from Emperor Alexios V, could offer only limited concessions that would not compromise the empire's independence or dignity. The crusading representatives, recognizing that their substantial investments in the expedition required tangible returns, demanded terms that would effectively have reduced the empire to a Western protectorate. The failure of these diplomatic initiatives was perhaps inevitable given the political pressures facing both sides and the legacy of mistrust that had developed over months of failed agreements and mutual recriminations. The crusading leaders, accountable to their followers and to the Venetians who had financed the expedition, could not accept arrangements that would leave them without adequate compensation for their efforts. The Byzantine government, facing a population that was increasingly hostile to Western influence, could not make concessions that would be seen as a continuation of the previous regime's subservience. The military preparations that began in earnest during March 1204 demonstrated the seriousness of both sides' commitment to resolving the crisis through force. The crusading army, which had maintained a degree of readiness throughout the winter months, began the systematic preparation of siege equipment and assault plans that would be necessary for a successful attack on Constantinople. The Venetian fleet, which had been partially dispersed during the winter for maintenance and resupply, was reassembled and prepared for the naval operations that would be crucial to any assault on the city. The defensive preparations ordered by Emperor Alexios V reflected both the government's determination to resist and its understanding of the military challenges that lay ahead. The city's walls, which had been partially damaged during the previous year's fighting, were repaired and strengthened with additional defensive works. The seawall, which had proven vulnerable to Venetian attack, was reinforced with new obstacles and defensive positions designed to prevent a repetition of the previous year's breakthrough. The imperial arsenal was inventoried and additional weapons were distributed to the civilian population, while emergency stores of food and supplies were accumulated in preparation for a prolonged siege. The mobilization of the Byzantine military forces available for the defense of Constantinople revealed both the empire's continuing capabilities and the severe limitations that had been imposed by decades of decline. The imperial army, while smaller and less well-equipped than in previous centuries, still included experienced units that had proven their effectiveness in various campaigns. The city's militia, consisting of civilians who had been trained in basic military skills, provided additional manpower for defensive operations. However, the total forces available to the emperor were insufficient to defend the city's extensive perimeter against a determined assault by the superior numbers and equipment of the crusading army. The psychological dimensions of the approaching confrontation were as important as the military preparations, as both sides sought to maintain morale while preparing for what all recognized would be a decisive battle. The crusading army, which had been sustained throughout the winter by the promise of rich rewards and the righteousness of their cause, faced the prospect of attacking the greatest Christian city in the world. The religious justifications that had been developed to support the expedition were strained to their limits by the reality of preparing to assault fellow Christians in their own capital. The Byzantine defenders, while fighting for their homes and their empire, faced the demoralization that came from their repeated defeats and the evident superiority of their enemies' military capabilities. The emperor's public pronouncements emphasized the religious and cultural significance of the defense, portraying the coming battle as a struggle between Eastern Christianity and Western aggression. The clergy played a crucial role in maintaining popular morale through sermons and religious ceremonies that emphasized the sacred nature of the city and the divine protection that would be afforded to its defenders. The economic impact of the prolonged crisis and the approaching military confrontation created additional hardships for the civilian population that complicated the city's defense. The normal commercial activities that had sustained Constantinople's prosperity had been disrupted for months, while the costs of military preparation placed additional burdens on the already strained imperial treasury. The price of food and other necessities rose dramatically as merchants hoarded supplies and trade routes were disrupted by the military situation. The social tensions that developed within the city during these months reflected the diverse composition of Constantinople's population and the different ways in which various groups experienced the crisis. The Greek Orthodox majority, while generally supportive of resistance to the Western invaders, included significant numbers who worried about the consequences of military defeat and the suffering that would be inflicted on the civilian population. The city's remaining Latin residents, many of whom had lived in Constantinople for generations, found themselves in an impossible position between their ethnic loyalties and their attachment to their adopted home. The intelligence networks that both sides employed during the winter months provided crucial information about enemy intentions and capabilities while revealing the extensive preparations that were being made for the coming confrontation. The crusading army, with its superior resources and organization, was able to gather detailed information about the city's defenses and the political situation within the Byzantine government. The Byzantine authorities, despite their limited resources, maintained networks of informants within the crusading camp that provided warning of the attackers' plans and timetables. The religious dimensions of the approaching conflict created particular challenges for the clergy on both sides, as they struggled to reconcile their theological beliefs with the political realities of the situation. The Latin clergy who accompanied the crusading army were forced to develop increasingly sophisticated justifications for attacking fellow Christians, while the Orthodox clergy within Constantinople faced the challenge of maintaining popular morale while preparing for what many recognized would be a catastrophic defeat. The arrival of spring weather in March 1204 marked the beginning of the final phase of the crisis, as both sides recognized that the military confrontation could no longer be delayed. The improved weather conditions would make military operations more feasible, while the political pressures on both sides made further negotiation impossible. The crusading army, which had been sustained throughout the winter by the promise of rich rewards, was becoming increasingly impatient for action and results. The final diplomatic exchanges that took place in early April 1204 represented the last desperate attempts to avoid the catastrophic confrontation that all recognized would destroy much of what both sides claimed to value. The Byzantine negotiators, operating under increasingly restrictive instructions from Emperor Alexios V, offered limited concessions that might have provided face-saving solutions under different circumstances. The crusading representatives, while recognizing the tragedy of the situation, were constrained by the practical realities of their financial obligations and the expectations of their followers. The breakdown of these final negotiations on April 8, 1204, marked the end of all diplomatic efforts and the beginning of the military operations that would culminate in the sack of Constantinople. The formal declaration of hostilities by both sides was accompanied by final preparations for what all recognized would be one of the most significant military confrontations of the medieval period. The stage was set for a battle that would determine not only the fate of the Byzantine Empire but also the future of Eastern Christianity and the balance of power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The psychological impact of the approaching assault on both the attackers and the defenders was profound and lasting, as all participants recognized that they were about to witness the end of an era. The crusading army, despite its military superiority, faced the prospect of destroying the greatest monument to Christian civilization in the East. The Byzantine defenders, while determined to resist, understood that defeat would mean not only the loss of their empire, but also the end of a 1,000-year tradition of Christian rule in Constantinople. The final days before the assault were marked by desperate preparations and last-minute attempts to strengthen defenses that all recognized were inadequate to resist the coming attack. The city's churches and monasteries became centers of prayer and religious observance as the population sought divine intervention to save their capital. The imperial palace, which had been the center of Byzantine power for centuries, was transformed into a fortress as the emperor and his remaining supporters prepared for what they knew would be their final stand. The approaching confrontation represented more than a military siege. It was a clash between two different visions of Christian civilization and two incompatible approaches to the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The outcome would determine not only the immediate fate of Constantinople, but also the future development of both Eastern and Western Christianity. The stage was set for one of the most significant and tragic events in medieval history, as the Fourth Crusade prepared to achieve its ultimate and unintended objective: the destruction of the Byzantine Empire and the sack of the greatest Christian city in the world. The final assault on Constantinople began at dawn on April 9, 1204, with a coordinated attack that demonstrated the full extent of the crusading army's military capabilities and organizational sophistication. The assault plan that had been developed during the winter months called for simultaneous attacks on multiple sections of the city's defenses, with the Venetian fleet concentrating its efforts on the seawall while the land forces focused on the most vulnerable portions of the Great Land Wall. The coordination required for such an operation was unprecedented in medieval warfare and reflected the advanced military thinking that had emerged from the synthesis of Western knightly traditions with Venetian naval expertise. The pre-dawn preparations for the assault were conducted with methodical precision, as thousands of men took their assigned positions and siege engines were moved into their final locations. The crusading army, which had been organized into carefully coordinated units during the winter months, demonstrated the discipline and training that had made Western military forces so effective throughout the Mediterranean world. The sight of the great siege towers and catapults being wheeled into position created a spectacle of military power that must have been both impressive and terrifying to the defenders watching from the city's walls. The Venetian naval assault began with the systematic approach of the modified war galleys that had been prepared specifically for this operation. The ships, equipped with siege engines and protected by wooden towers that had been constructed on their decks, advanced toward the seawall in a formation that maximized their ability to coordinate their assault while minimizing their vulnerability to defensive fire. The elderly Doge Dandolo, despite his blindness and advanced age, insisted on personally leading the naval attack from the deck of his flagship, providing both tactical leadership and symbolic inspiration for the Venetian forces. The initial phase of the assault was marked by intense bombardment from both sides, as the attackers attempted to breach the city's defenses while the defenders sought to repel the assault through concentrated fire from their own artillery. The great catapults and mangonels that had been positioned along the walls hurled massive stones and incendiary devices at the approaching ships and siege towers, while the crusading artillery replied with systematic bombardment designed to create breaches in the fortifications. The sound of the bombardment, described by contemporary chroniclers as resembling thunder, could be heard throughout the city and served as a constant reminder to the civilian population of the battle raging for their survival. The breakthrough that would ultimately doom the city's defense came not through the massive frontal assault that had been expected, but through a combination of technical innovation and tactical opportunism that demonstrated the Crusaders' adaptability. The Venetian engineers, working under the direction of experienced siege specialists, had developed a technique for approaching the seawall that involved the use of specially constructed floating bridges that could be extended from the ships to the wall itself. This innovation, combined with the concentrated fire of the ship-mounted artillery, created opportunities for small groups of assault troops to establish footholds on the wall that could then be expanded through systematic reinforcement. The critical moment in the assault came when a group of Venetian Marines, led by experienced officers who had participated in numerous siege operations, succeeded in scaling the seawall and establishing a defensive position that could not be dislodged by the Byzantine counterattacks. The fighting on the wall was fierce and desperate, with hand-to-hand combat using swords, axes, and daggers determining the outcome at crucial points. The sight of Western banners being raised on the seawall had an enormous psychological impact on both sides, as it demonstrated that the city's supposedly impregnable defenses could indeed be breached. The expansion of the Venetian foothold along the seawall was accomplished through a combination of systematic assault and the exploitation of defensive weaknesses that had been identified during the previous year's fighting. The Byzantine defenders, while brave and determined, lacked the coordinated command structure and the reserves necessary to mount effective counterattacks against the established Western positions. The gradual extension of crusading control along the waterfront created opportunities for additional troops to be landed from the fleet, while the capture of key defensive positions undermined the entire defensive system. The land assault that accompanied the naval attack was initially less successful, as the Great Land Wall proved more resistant to the siege techniques that had been employed against it. The massive fortifications, built and rebuilt over centuries to withstand the most determined attacks, absorbed the punishment inflicted by the crusading siege engines without suffering critical damage. The defenders of the land wall, commanded by experienced Byzantine officers and supported by the city's militia, mounted fierce resistance that demonstrated their determination to defend their city regardless of the cost. However, the success of the naval assault created new tactical possibilities that the crusading commanders were quick to exploit. The establishment of secure positions along the seawall enabled the attackers to threaten the land wall from both sides simultaneously, while the capture of harbor facilities provided opportunities for the landing of additional troops and supplies. The coordination of attacks from multiple directions placed enormous strains on the Byzantine defensive system and forced the defenders to divide their already limited forces among multiple threatened sectors. The fire that broke out in the district behind the seawall during the second day of the assault added another dimension of chaos to an already desperate situation. The blaze, which may have been started by incendiary devices or by the accident of combat, spread rapidly through the densely packed buildings of the commercial quarter. The flames, driven by strong winds and fed by the wooden structures and stored goods that filled the area, created a wall of fire that separated the defenders from their supply lines and reinforcements. The psychological impact of the fire was perhaps even more significant than its immediate tactical effects, as it created a sense of impending doom that undermined the morale of the city's defenders. The emperor's attempts to coordinate the defense from the imperial palace demonstrated both his personal courage and the limitations of Byzantine command capabilities under the extreme pressures of the siege. Alexios V, despite his inexperience in siege warfare, showed remarkable personal bravery in visiting the most threatened sections of the defenses and encouraging his troops through his presence. However, the emperor's efforts were hampered by the breakdown of communication systems and the inability to move reserves quickly enough to respond to the rapidly changing tactical situation. The breakthrough that sealed the city's fate came on the morning of April 12, 1204, when crusading forces succeeded in opening one of the gates in the land wall through a combination of assault and internal sabotage. The exact details of how this breakthrough was achieved remain unclear, but it appears to have involved the cooperation of elements within the city who had concluded that further resistance was futile. The opening of the gate enabled large numbers of crusading troops to enter the city proper, transforming what had been a siege into urban combat that the defenders were ill-equipped to handle. The fighting that followed the breakthrough was characterized by the systematic advance of crusading forces through the city streets, with organized resistance giving way to desperate individual actions as the defensive structure collapsed. The narrow streets and densely packed buildings of Constantinople provided opportunities for ambushes and surprise attacks, but the superior organization and equipment of the crusading forces gradually overcame all resistance. The sight of Western knights and soldiers advancing through the heart of the Byzantine capital created scenes of chaos and panic that contemporary chroniclers found difficult to describe adequately. The emperor's final attempts to rally his remaining forces demonstrated both the hopelessness of the military situation and his own determination to defend his capital to the last. Alexios V, accompanied by a small group of loyal supporters, attempted to organize counterattacks that might have restored some stability to the defensive effort. However, these efforts were hampered by the collapse of military discipline and the growing panic among both soldiers and civilians as the reality of the city's capture became apparent. The decision by Emperor Alexios V to abandon the defense and flee the city was made when it became clear that organized resistance was no longer possible and that his capture would serve no useful purpose. The emperor's escape, accomplished through the use of small boats that carried him and his closest supporters across the Bosphorus, marked the end of organized Byzantine resistance and the collapse of the imperial government. The news of the emperor's flight spread rapidly through the city, completing the demoralization of the remaining defenders and eliminating any possibility of continued resistance. The surrender of Constantinople was not a formal process but rather a gradual collapse of resistance as individual commanders and units recognized that further fighting was futile. The white banners that began to appear on the city's walls and towers signaled the end of active resistance, while the opening of gates and the laying down of arms by Byzantine troops marked the final capitulation. The site of the great city that had resisted attacks for over 8 centuries finally falling to foreign conquest created a sense of historical finality that affected both victors and vanquished. The entry of the crusading leaders into the city was marked by a mixture of triumph and apprehension, as they realized that they had achieved something that no previous enemy had been able to accomplish. The capture of Constantinople represented not merely a military victory but the end of an era, as the city that had been the center of Eastern Christianity for over 1,000 years passed into Western hands. The responsibility for governing and protecting the population of the greatest city in the Eastern Mediterranean was now theirs, creating challenges that would prove as difficult as the siege itself had been. The immediate aftermath of the city's capture was characterized by a complex mixture of organized military occupation and spontaneous celebration, as the crusading forces sought to establish control while their individual members began to explore the riches of the captured city. The systematic search for treasure and valuable objects that began immediately after the surrender reflected both the financial motivations that had driven the expedition and the practical need to compensate the various participants for their investments and efforts. The reaction of Constantinople's civilian population to the city's capture varied enormously, reflecting the diverse composition of the city's inhabitants and their different experiences during the siege. Many residents, particularly those in the areas that had been most heavily damaged by the fighting, were primarily concerned with their immediate survival and the protection of their families and property. Others, particularly members of the city's elite who had supported the previous government, faced the prospect of political persecution and economic ruin under the new regime. The religious communities within the city, including the numerous monasteries and churches that had made Constantinople a center of Eastern Christianity, faced particular challenges as they attempted to protect their sacred objects and maintain their religious practices under foreign rule. The prospect of forced conversion to Latin Christianity or the confiscation of church property created anxiety among the clergy and the devout laity who had supported the Orthodox resistance to papal authority. The logistical challenges facing the crusading army in the immediate aftermath of the city's capture were enormous, as they needed to establish effective governance over a population of several 100,000 people while maintaining military discipline among their own forces. The distribution of food and supplies, the maintenance of public order, and the establishment of new administrative systems all required immediate attention while the army was still in the flush of victory and eager to enjoy the fruits of their conquest. The political implications of Constantinople's capture extended far beyond the immediate military situation, as the fall of the Byzantine Empire created a power vacuum that would reshape the entire Eastern Mediterranean. The news of the city's capture, when it reached Western Europe, would be greeted with mixed reactions that reflected the complex motivations and expectations that had surrounded the Fourth Crusade from its inception. The capture of the greatest city in Eastern Christianity by Western forces would be seen by some as a triumph of Latin Christianity, while others would recognize it as a catastrophic blow to Christian unity and strength. The stage was now set for the final act of the Fourth Crusade's transformation from a holy war into a commercial and political venture, as the victorious crusaders faced the challenge of dividing the spoils of victory while establishing new governmental structures that could maintain their control over their conquests. The sack of Constantinople, which would begin within hours of the city's surrender, would complete the transformation of the expedition from a religious crusade into one of the most destructive events in medieval history. The systematic looting of Constantinople that began on April 13, 1204, represented one of the most comprehensive and destructive acts of cultural vandalism in human history. The 3 days of sanctioned pillaging that followed the city's capitulation transformed the greatest repository of Christian art, learning, and culture in the Eastern world into a scene of devastation that would never be fully repaired. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented, not merely because of the wealth that was seized, but because of the irreplaceable cultural treasures that were lost forever through ignorance, greed, and deliberate vandalism. The initial phase of the sack was characterized by the systematic search for portable wealth that could be easily transported and converted into cash. The crusading army, which had been organized into carefully coordinated units during the siege, maintained some degree of discipline during the first hours of the looting, with officers attempting to ensure that the most valuable items were collected for later distribution according to the agreements that had been made before the assault. However, the sight of such unprecedented wealth and the excitement of victory quickly eroded military discipline, leading to increasingly violent and chaotic scenes throughout the city. The churches and monasteries of Constantinople, which contained the accumulated religious treasures of over 8 centuries of imperial patronage, became the primary targets of the looters' attention. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in the Eastern Christian world, was systematically stripped of its precious ornaments, including the great altar screen made of silver and gold, the countless icons decorated with precious stones, and the elaborate silk hangings that had been donated by generations of emperors and nobles. The desecration of the high altar, where a prostitute was reportedly seated to sing ribald songs while soldiers tore down the sacred furnishings, represented a particularly shocking violation of Christian sanctity that horrified even some of the participants. The destruction of religious art and artifacts went far beyond mere theft, as many of the looters showed no understanding of the cultural and spiritual significance of the objects they were destroying. Icons that had been venerated for centuries were broken apart to extract their precious metal frames, while manuscripts illuminated with gold and silver were torn up to recover the valuable materials. The famous mosaic decorations that adorned the city's churches were systematically damaged as soldiers attempted to pry loose the gold and silver tesserae, leaving behind scarred walls that testified to the extent of the vandalism. The imperial palace complex, which had been the center of Byzantine power for centuries, was thoroughly ransacked by looters who showed no respect for the historical significance of their surroundings. The throne room, where emperors had received ambassadors from throughout the known world, was stripped of its precious furnishings, including the great throne itself, which was broken apart to recover its gold and silver components. The imperial regalia, including crowns, scepters, and ceremonial weapons that had been used in coronation ceremonies for generations, were either stolen outright or melted down to recover their precious metal content. The libraries and scriptoriums that had preserved classical learning and Christian scholarship were particularly vulnerable to destruction, as the looters showed little interest in manuscripts and books that had no obvious monetary value. The imperial library, which contained thousands of ancient texts including works by classical authors that existed nowhere else in the world, was scattered and destroyed as soldiers searched for more obviously valuable items. Many manuscripts were used as kindling for fires or simply discarded as worthless, resulting in the permanent loss of irreplaceable works of literature, philosophy, and science. The private residences of the city's wealthy inhabitants were systematically looted, with particular attention paid to the homes of those who had supported the previous government or who were known to possess significant wealth. The palaces of the great noble families, many of which had been built over generations and contained priceless collections of art and antiquities, were thoroughly searched and stripped of their contents. The family chapels and private oratories that were attached to these residences suffered the same fate as the public churches, with their religious treasures being seized regardless of their sacred character. The commercial districts of the city, which had been the center of international trade for centuries, were particularly attractive targets for looters who understood the value of the goods stored in the warehouses and shops. The silk workshops that had produced some of the finest textiles in the world were ransacked, with both finished products and raw materials being seized. The goldsmith shops and jewelry stores that had served the city's wealthy clientele were completely emptied, while the banking houses that had financed international commerce were stripped of their accumulated wealth. The violence that accompanied the looting was both systematic and random, reflecting the breakdown of military discipline and the unleashing of impulses that had been suppressed during the long months of preparation and siege. The civilian population, which had been promised protection in exchange for surrender, found themselves at the mercy of soldiers who showed little restraint in their treatment of the conquered inhabitants. Women of all social classes were subjected to rape and other forms of sexual violence, while men who attempted to protect their families or property were often killed or severely beaten. The treatment of the clergy was particularly shocking, as many priests and monks were tortured to reveal the location of hidden treasures, or were killed when they attempted to protect their church's sacred objects. The violation of sanctuary, a principle that had been respected even in the most bitter conflicts, demonstrated the extent to which the sack had descended into pure barbarism. Elderly priests were beaten and humiliated, while nuns were driven from their convents and subjected to the same violence that was being inflicted on the general population. The organized distribution of plunder that had been planned by the crusading leadership proved impossible to implement given the chaos and violence that characterized the sack. The agreements that had been made before the assault, which called for the systematic collection and division of booty according to predetermined shares, were largely ignored as individual soldiers and groups seized whatever they could carry. The Venetians, with their superior organization and commercial expertise, were more successful than others in securing valuable items, but even they were unable to prevent the widespread destruction and waste that characterized the event. The destruction of artistic treasures reached levels that went far beyond rational economic calculation, as many valuable objects were destroyed simply because they were too large or too heavy to be easily transported. Magnificent sculptures were broken apart to recover small amounts of precious metal, while elaborate architectural decorations were torn down and destroyed in the search for valuable materials. The famous bronze horses that had decorated the hippodrome were among the few large artistic objects that were successfully removed and transported to Venice, where they became symbols of the Republic's triumph. The burning of buildings and neighborhoods during the sack added another dimension of destruction that went far beyond the immediate goals of the looters. Fires were set both accidentally and deliberately, with some areas being burned to drive out defenders or hidden treasures, while other fires started from the simple carelessness of drunken soldiers. The resulting blazes destroyed not only buildings but also countless works of art, manuscripts, and other cultural treasures that had survived the initial looting but fell victim to the flames. The psychological impact of the sack on the city's surviving population was profound and lasting, creating trauma that would influence Byzantine attitudes toward the West for generations. The systematic humiliation and degradation that accompanied the looting was designed not merely to extract wealth but to demonstrate the complete subjugation of the conquered population. The forced participation of Byzantine nobles in degrading ceremonies and the public display of stolen religious objects created a sense of cultural violation that went far beyond material loss. The international implications of the sack began to emerge as news of the destruction spread throughout the Christian world. The papal reaction, when it finally came, was one of horror and condemnation, as Pope Innocent III recognized that the expedition he had sponsored had become a source of scandal and division rather than Christian unity. The Eastern Orthodox churches, when they learned of the desecration of Constantinople's holy sites, saw the event as confirmation of their worst fears about Western Christianity and its respect for Eastern traditions. The economic consequences of the sack extended far beyond the immediate seizure of wealth, as the destruction of Constantinople's commercial infrastructure disrupted trade patterns throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The banking houses and merchant networks that had facilitated international commerce were destroyed or severely damaged, while the craftsmen and artisans who had produced luxury goods for international markets were scattered or killed. The city's position as the commercial hub connecting Europe with Asia was permanently compromised, leading to the development of alternative trade routes that bypassed the former imperial capital. The cultural losses resulting from the sack were immeasurable and irreversible, representing the destruction of artistic and intellectual treasures that had been accumulated over centuries of imperial patronage and Christian devotion. The manuscripts that were destroyed or lost contained works of classical literature, philosophy, and science that existed nowhere else in the world, while the artistic treasures that were seized or destroyed represented the pinnacle of Byzantine creative achievement. The impact on learning and scholarship was particularly severe, as the libraries and schools that had preserved and transmitted classical knowledge were scattered or destroyed. The administrative challenges facing the crusading leadership in the aftermath of the sack were enormous, as they needed to establish some form of governmental control over a devastated and traumatized population. The systematic destruction of the city's infrastructure, including government buildings, courts, and administrative offices, made it difficult to establish effective governance, while the hostility of the surviving population created ongoing security challenges. The need to maintain order while extracting maximum value from the conquered territories required administrative skills that few of the crusading leaders possessed. The distribution of the seized wealth among the various participants in the expedition created conflicts and disputes that would persist for years. The Venetians, who had financed much of the expedition, claimed the largest share of the booty, while the various national contingents within the crusading army argued over their respective portions. The individual soldiers who had participated in the looting were reluctant to surrender their personal gains for redistribution, leading to conflicts between the rank and file and their commanders. The transformation of Constantinople from the greatest city in Eastern Christianity into a devastated ruin marked the end of an era that had lasted for over 1,000 years. The physical destruction of buildings, artworks, and infrastructure was matched by the psychological and cultural trauma inflicted on the surviving population. The city that had been the center of a vast empire and the repository of classical and Christian learning was reduced to a shadow of its former self, never to regain its previous prominence and influence. The sack of Constantinople represented the ultimate perversion of the crusading ideal, as an expedition that had been launched to strengthen and unite the Christian world had instead delivered a devastating blow to one of Christianity's greatest centers. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers, who recognized that the Fourth Crusade had achieved the opposite of its stated objectives, weakening rather than strengthening the Christian position in the Eastern Mediterranean while creating divisions that would never be fully healed. The 3 days of violence and destruction that followed the city's capture would be remembered as one of the darkest chapters in the history of the crusading movement and a defining moment in the relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity. The establishment of the Latin Empire of Constantinople in May 1204 represented an unprecedented attempt to impose Western feudal institutions on the territories of the former Byzantine Empire. The political arrangements that emerged from the Crusaders' victory were based on the Treaty of Partition, negotiated between the Venetians and the crusading leaders before the final assault, which divided the Byzantine territories according to Western concepts of feudal obligation and commercial advantage. The creation of this new imperial structure required the development of entirely new governmental institutions that could accommodate the cultural and religious diversity of the conquered territories while maintaining the political dominance of the Western conquerors. The election of Baldwin of Flanders as the first Latin emperor was the result of complex negotiations that reflected both the political realities of the conquest and the competing interests of the various contingents within the crusading army. Baldwin's selection was supported by the Venetians, who recognized that his relative weakness would make him more amenable to their commercial interests, while his noble rank and reputation for competence made him acceptable to the other crusading leaders. The coronation ceremony, held in the Hagia Sophia on May 16, 1204, was a carefully orchestrated event that attempted to combine traditional Byzantine imperial symbolism with Western feudal concepts of kingship. The territorial organization of the Latin Empire reflected the military and political realities of the conquest while attempting to create a sustainable governmental structure. The empire was divided into numerous feudal principalities and duchies, each governed by Western nobles who owed allegiance to the emperor while maintaining considerable autonomy in their own territories. The Venetians received the promised quarter of the empire, including crucial commercial centers and strategic islands that would enhance their dominance of Eastern Mediterranean trade. The complexity of these arrangements created a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting loyalties that would plague the empire throughout its brief existence. The administrative challenges facing the Latin Empire were enormous, as the new rulers needed to govern a population that was overwhelmingly Orthodox Christian, Greek-speaking, and hostile to Western rule. The imposition of Latin religious practices and feudal legal systems on territories that had been governed by Byzantine institutions for centuries created constant friction and resistance. The language barriers between the Western rulers and their subjects made effective communication difficult, While the cultural differences between Latin and Byzantine Christianity created ongoing religious conflicts that undermined the empire's stability, the economic foundations of the Latin Empire were fatally weakened by the destruction that had accompanied the conquest and the disruption of traditional trade patterns. The sack of Constantinople had destroyed much of the city's commercial infrastructure, while the political fragmentation of the former Byzantine territories made it difficult to maintain the administrative systems that had supported imperial revenues. The Venetians, while successful in securing their commercial interests, were unable to restore the sophisticated trade networks that had made Constantinople wealthy, leading to a long-term decline in the empire's economic vitality. The military organization of the Latin Empire reflected the realities of governing a hostile population with limited resources and foreign troops. The Western knights and soldiers who had participated in the conquest were gradually dispersed throughout the empire's territories, where they established feudal holdings and attempted to maintain control through a combination of military force and political accommodation. However, the small number of Western settlers relative to the size of the conquered territories made effective control difficult, while the continuing hostility of the Orthodox population created constant security challenges. The religious policies of the Latin Empire created some of the most serious obstacles to its long-term stability, as the new rulers' attempts to impose Roman Catholic practices on the Orthodox population generated fierce resistance. The appointment of Latin patriarchs and bishops to replace the Orthodox hierarchy was particularly controversial, as it challenged the religious identity that had been central to Byzantine cultural distinctiveness. The forced conversion of Orthodox churches to Latin liturgical practices created widespread resentment, while the attempts to compel Orthodox clergy to accept papal authority were largely unsuccessful. The fragmentation of the Byzantine Empire that resulted from the Fourth Crusade created new political entities that would reshape the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The Empire of Nicaea, established by Theodore Lascaris in Western Anatolia, claimed to be the legitimate continuation of the Byzantine Empire and maintained the traditions of Orthodox Christianity and Greek culture. The Empire of Trebizond, founded by Alexios and David Komnenos in northeastern Anatolia, established another center of Byzantine revival that would survive until the 15th century. The Despotate of Epirus, created in northwestern Greece, provided yet another focal point for resistance to Latin rule. The survival and development of these Byzantine successor states demonstrated the resilience of Eastern Christian civilization and the fundamental weakness of the Latin Empire's political structure. The Empire of Nicaea, in particular, proved capable of maintaining effective government and military organization while preserving the cultural and religious traditions that had defined Byzantine identity. The gradual expansion of Nicaean territory at the expense of the Latin Empire reflected both the military competence of the Orthodox rulers and the declining strength of the Western colonial regime. The international implications of the Fourth Crusade's outcome extended far beyond the immediate territorial changes in the Eastern Mediterranean. The papal reaction to the sack of Constantinople created a crisis of authority within the Catholic Church, as Pope Innocent III struggled to maintain his support for the crusading movement while condemning the violence and destruction that had accompanied the conquest. The Pope's attempts to legitimize the Latin Empire while criticizing the methods by which it had been established created theological and political contradictions that weakened papal authority and undermined the unity of Western Christianity. The impact of the Crusade on the broader struggle between Christianity and Islam was largely negative, as the destruction of Byzantine power removed a crucial barrier to Islamic expansion in southeastern Europe. The weakening of the Eastern Christian states that had traditionally opposed Islamic expansion created opportunities for Muslim powers to advance into territories that had been Christian for centuries. The fragmentation of Christian resistance in the Eastern Mediterranean made it easier for Islamic forces to achieve territorial gains that would have been impossible against a unified Byzantine Empire. The economic consequences of the Fourth Crusade transformed the patterns of international trade throughout the medieval world. The Venetian acquisition of key commercial positions in the former Byzantine Empire enhanced their dominance of Mediterranean commerce, while the destruction of Constantinople's role as a commercial hub led to the development of alternative trade routes. The transfer of wealth from Constantinople to Venice and other Western centers contributed to the economic development of Western Europe while impoverishing the Eastern Mediterranean. The cultural impact of the Crusade was equally profound, as the destruction of Constantinople's libraries and schools represented an irreplaceable loss to European learning and scholarship. The manuscripts and artistic treasures that were destroyed or dispersed contained works of classical literature, philosophy, and science that existed nowhere else in the world. The disruption of the scholarly traditions that had been maintained in Constantinople contributed to the temporary decline of intellectual life in the Eastern Mediterranean while transferring some elements of Byzantine learning to Western Europe. The attempts by the Latin Empire to maintain its control over the former Byzantine territories were hampered by the fundamental contradictions inherent in its political structure. The feudal system that had been imposed on the conquered territories was ill-suited to the urban and commercial culture that had characterized Byzantine civilization. The Western nobles who governed the various principalities and duchies were often more interested in extracting wealth from their territories than in developing effective governmental institutions, leading to administrative chaos and popular resistance. The military challenges facing the Latin Empire intensified as the Byzantine successor states developed their capabilities and began systematic campaigns to recover their lost territories. The Empire of Nicaea, under the leadership of John III Doukas Vatatzes, proved particularly effective in combining military efficiency with diplomatic skill, gradually expanding its territory while building alliances with other opponents of Latin rule. The empire's ability to maintain professional armies and effective administrative systems contrasted sharply with the declining capabilities of the Latin Empire. The gradual decline of the Latin Empire during the 1240s and 1250s reflected both the inherent weaknesses of its political structure and the growing strength of its opponents. The empire's inability to maintain effective control over its territories, combined with its financial difficulties and the hostility of its Orthodox subjects, created a spiral of decline that proved impossible to reverse. The Western reinforcements that periodically arrived from Europe were insufficient to address the fundamental problems facing the colonial regime. The reconquest of Constantinople by Michael VIII Palaiologos in 1261 marked the formal end of the Latin Empire and the restoration of Byzantine rule in the ancient imperial capital. The recovery of the city was achieved through a combination of military action and diplomatic negotiation, with the final assault being launched from the Empire of Nicaea with the support of Genoese naval forces. The restoration ceremony, held in the Hagia Sophia on August 15, 1261, was a carefully orchestrated event that emphasized the continuity of Byzantine traditions and the legitimacy of the restored empire. However, the Byzantium that emerged from the Latin occupation was fundamentally different from the empire that had existed before 1204. The territorial losses were permanent, with the restored empire controlling only a fraction of the territories that had been governed by its predecessors. The economic damage caused by the sack and the subsequent decades of warfare had permanently weakened the empire's financial resources, while the political fragmentation that had characterized the Latin period had created new power centers that could not be easily reintegrated into a unified imperial system. The long-term consequences of the Fourth Crusade for the development of European civilization were profound and lasting. The permanent weakening of the Byzantine Empire removed a crucial barrier to Ottoman expansion into Europe, ultimately contributing to the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. The religious divisions that had been deepened by the Crusade created lasting mistrust between Eastern and Western Christianity that would influence European politics for centuries. The economic and cultural changes that resulted from the Crusade contributed to the shifting balance of power within Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. The historical significance of the Fourth Crusade extends far beyond its immediate military and political consequences. The event represented a fundamental turning point in the relationship between Eastern and Western Christianity, marking the end of any realistic possibility of reunification between the two branches of the Christian Church. The Crusade's transformation from a holy war into a commercial venture demonstrated the complex interplay between religious, political, and economic motivations that characterized medieval European society. The legacy of the Fourth Crusade in historical memory has been shaped by its dramatic character and its far-reaching consequences. The event has been remembered as a symbol of the corruption of religious ideals by secular ambitions, while also representing the cultural and political dynamism that characterized medieval European expansion. The sack of Constantinople has become synonymous with the destruction of cultural treasures and the violence that could accompany religious warfare, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fanaticism and greed. The influence of the Fourth Crusade on subsequent historical developments was both direct and indirect, as the political and cultural changes that resulted from the conquest continued to shape European development for centuries. The Venetian commercial dominance that was established during this period would influence Mediterranean trade patterns until the age of oceanic exploration, while the weakening of Byzantine power would create conditions that facilitated the eventual Ottoman conquest of southeastern Europe. The Crusades' impact on the development of feudal institutions and the relationship between church and state would also have lasting consequences for European political development. The Fourth Crusade thus stands as one of the most significant and controversial events in medieval history, representing both the achievements and the failures of medieval European civilization. The expedition's transformation from a holy war into a commercial venture, its ultimate success in achieving unintended objectives, and its catastrophic consequences for Eastern Christianity make it a complex and enduring subject of historical study. The event serves as a reminder of the unpredictable nature of historical causation and the ways in which human ambitions and limitations can shape the course of civilizational development. The sack of Constantinople remains a powerful symbol of both the creative and destructive potential of human enterprise, marking the end of one historical era and the beginning of another in the complex tapestry of European and Mediterranean history.